Chapter 2467. According to the information that Luo Fan had obtained so far, this mountain was probably a place where a true saint once stayed when he came to the Tao Master Path. The Tao Master Path was divided into 9 levels, and the 5th level was right in the middle of the 9 levels. If a true saint really came to visit, it was very likely that he would stay on the 5th level. At least, compared to the highest level, the 9th level, or the lowest level, it was more likely that he would stay on the 5th level. From this point of view, the 4 figures that Luo Fan had seen before, sitting beside the stone table in the pavilion, were obviously the figures that had been left behind by a true sage countless years ago. If he thought further based on this premise, then he would have answers to many of the questions that he had been unable to figure out before. For example, why was there a mountain here? Why was there a chaotic starry sky here? Why was there darkness here? Why was this mountain so vast? Why was it so mysterious? Why did it give him such a terrifying pressure? Why was it something he couldn't understand? Everything. The explanation was even simpler. It was because this was the place where a true saint once stayed. As long as there was this explanation, all the previous questions were reasonable. After all, the existence of a true saint was billions of times stronger than Luo Fan now. It was natural for such an existence to have any incredible things happen to them, not to mention the addition of such a strange place and such a mountain. Even if there were more and more incredible existences, to a true sage, it was extremely normal. Visit? Maybe the relationship between different true saints is closer than I thought before. This thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind, and a look of relief appeared on his face. At this time, the pavilion seemed to have completely restored the empty appearance that he had seen at the beginning. In this pavilion, he had a feeling that he was in an extremely pure place to stay. All the rules and laws here, energy and matter, and even the great way in the dark, produced some subtle distortion in this pavilion. Under this combination of distortion, it created a place that was most suitable for living beings to stay. Even Luo Fan felt that his body and mind had become inexplicably peaceful due to the influence of the environment. With a thought, he walked to the stone table in the center. The stone table and the stone stool seemed to be made of the same material as the pavilion, but at this moment, they gave off an indescribable aura, as if they were the embodiment of an eternal and indestructible concept. Faintly, there was even a feeling that the entire pavilion was actually supported by the stone table and the stone bench, which was why it did not collapse. With a thought, Luo Fan raised his hand and pressed it on the stone table in front of him. The moment his palm came into contact with the stone table, he suddenly felt his vision blur. Endless information poured into his mind through his eyes. This information was vast and boundless. The amount of information was countless times more than what he had received when he saw the 4 figures and listened to their conversation. In just a moment, Luo Fan's body suddenly shook and instantly collapsed from the inside out, shattering into pieces. At this moment, his body and his mind were all blown away by the information. Fortunately, this information only came from the real world and did not affect his other realms. Therefore, soon, under the effect of the existence corresponding to him in other realms, his body walked out of the void and returned to his original position. What happened just now? After coming back to life, Luo Fan was still a little confused, and even his mind was blank for a while. He did not know what had just happened, and he could not even remember what he had done before he died. After a long while, the shock wave from the information slowly disappeared. Only then did his mind gradually regain its clarity. Only then did he gradually recall everything that he had experienced before his death. That is the whole Tao Master's path. As he recalled the experience just now, an inexplicable shock appeared on his face. The information that poured into his heart and made his body and mind explode in an instant was none other than the appearance of the entire road to becoming a Tao Master. However, because of the problem of the realms, the information had almost completely disappeared with the collapse of his body and mind. Only a general outline was left in his heart. It was also because of the outline of this 9-level structure, combined with the reason why those true saints stayed here, that he finally guessed the the possibility that the information was the entire Tao Master's path. With this idea in mind, at this moment, Luo Fan did not think too much and once again pressed his hand on the stone table. A huge amount of information frantically poured into his mind again. With a soft poof, his body and mind completely collapsed from the inside out again. In the blink of an eye, his original incomparably solid appearance turned into nothingness after a while. Luo Fan's figure reappeared with the help of the existence corresponding to him in other realms. After appearing, without the slightest hesitation, he once again pressed the stone table. Then, with another soft puff, his body collapsed once more. In this way, Luo Fan received the information contained in the stone table again and again. His body and mind collapsed again and again, and he was resurrected again and again, repeating the previous process. In this repeated process, time gradually passed. Unknowingly, 10,000 years had passed. In these 10,000 years, the number of times that Luo Fan had died and been resurrected could be counted in billions of trillions. Every time he died and was resurrected, it did not change the time that he could endure the next time he faced the information. It was as if his death and resurrection were of no use at all. No matter how many times he died and was resurrected, his body directly collapsed as soon as his palm pressed on the stone table. In contrast, the pain that he suffered after each death did not lessen because of the number of times he died. Every time he died, he completely felt the despair of death and the pain that appeared when the information exploded. Under such circumstances, he could still endure for tens of thousands of years. The number of deaths here was calculated in billions of trillions, which was enough to show how firm his mind was. Unfortunately, after all, there is still a long way to go. At my level, I can't really see the whole road to Tao Master. After a rebirth, Luo Fan finally sighed and stopped the endless cycle of life and death. It was unknown how many trillions of deaths there were. Even if the information left after each death was only an insignificant bit, the accumulated amount of information would still be unimaginably huge after countless trillions of deaths. Therefore, through the continuous death of 10,000 years, Luo Fan had gradually seen a lot of things from the information. From the information that he had seen clearly, he had already confirmed that the information was describing the overall appearance of the road to Tao Master. However, because his level was too far from the whole road to Tao Master, he could only see a small part of it. For example, he had already experienced the first, second, third, and fourth levels of the road to Tao Master. He had already seen it quite clearly and knew the specific appearance of the road to Tao Master. Through the information, he even saw many secrets that he had not discovered when he was on that level. However, as for the fifth level and above, the more he looked up, the more blurred it became. He could still roughly see the fifth level, and he could also receive some of the more special and mysterious profundities. However, when he reached the sixth level, he could only vaguely see the outline, and he could not see any specific details at all. As for the higher seventh, eighth, and ninth levels, even though he had died so many times, he could only learn from the information that these three levels existed. He could not get more specific information. This situation was similar to what he felt about the first few levels when he had not died enough times. However, as for the information that followed, no matter how many times he died, he could not improve the clarity of the information at all. This point had been verified by the recent deaths that were calculated in billions of trillions. It was also because of this that he stopped the previous cycle of life and death. Although the pain of death was nothing to him, he did not care about this kind of cycle of life and death. However, if this kind of death and rebirth was useless, then it was obviously not necessary. In the information, this mountain seems to be a strange place. It seems to hide a kind of perfect opportunity of the light of heaven and earth. Recalling the previous information, this thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. Since this place could be used by a true saint as a place to stay, it naturally would not be an ordinary place. Not to mention that because a true saint had once stayed here, The original abnormality of this place had been strengthened many times, making it much more mysterious than before. In that case, how could the uniqueness of this mountain not be marked in the information? Since it was marked, how could Luo Fan, who was on this mountain, not pay attention to it? Just as he was about to leave this place and head into the depths of the mountain to search for the opportunity, suddenly, Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat and an inexplicable impulse emerged from the bottom of his heart. This stone table that a true saint leaned on is so mysterious. Perhaps if I sit on a true saint's seat, I might gain more benefits. Although he knew that this idea was equivalent to courting death, Luo Fan could not resist this impulse in the end. His heart skipped a beat. He walked to the nearest stone chair and slowly sat down on it. The moment his body touched the stone chair, an extremely calm power emerged from the stone chair and gently swept across Luo Fan's body. Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth moved frantically in an attempt to block this power. However, it was a pity that even though this power seemed weak, it was not something that Luo Fan could block with any means he had mastered. Even the light of heaven and earth could not do anything in the face of this seemingly weak power. Under this power, it was as if it did not exist and did not affect the power at all. The power directly landed on Luo Fan's body. Following this power, Luo Fan's body directly collapsed. This collapse was completely different from the previous situation where he had been completely destroyed by the information shock. At this moment, Luo Fan's collapse was extremely thorough. Even all traces of his existence in the real world were constantly being erased by this power. The information he left outside the gazebo, and even the conversation and interaction between him and the two cultivators who had completely fused with his heaven and earth light, gradually dissipated at this moment. Translator, Zephy's editor, Dio Quinn. What dissipated along with it were all the results of Luo Fan's actions in the outer layer of the world. This included the results of the young city lord leaving that world and stepping into the chaotic starry sky. All these changes were not limited to the real world. In many other worlds, the existence corresponding to Luo Fan was also continuously being erased at the same time. In just a few short breaths, the existence corresponding to Luo Fan in more than half of the worlds was completely erased. If this continued, it would not be long before Luo Fan really died, and it would be impossible for him to recover. At this moment, an inexplicable sigh came from the depths of Luo Fan's mind, which existed in an incomparably mysterious manner. It seems that I'm not suitable for courting death. In the face of this incredible power, Luo Fan could no longer think of any way to resist it. It could be said that the only thing he could do now was to face the impending death with a positive attitude. Just as Luo Fan was quietly waiting, the small wisp of power that was released from the stone bench finally came to a complete stop. Obviously, it was not without loss to completely erase all traces of Luo Fan, and even all traces of his existence in other worlds. After layers of erasure and loss, it was clear that after the traces of Luo Fan's existence in more than half of the worlds were completely erased, this wisp of power had reached its limit and was finally exhausted. Seeing this scene, an indescribable surprise emerged in Luo Fan's heart. At this moment, he did not dare to hesitate at all. He roused the corresponding existences in the worlds that he had survived and tried his best to restore his corresponding existences in the many other worlds. Not long after, his figure finally slowly appeared in the real world. The countless traces that belonged to him that had been erased before also reappeared with his appearance. The various scenes that originally seemed to have been reversed gradually returned to their original appearance during this process. Chapter 2468. After a while, Luo Fan's figure finally appeared in reality. However, the place where he appeared was no longer on the stone bench. Instead, he appeared at the entrance of the pavilion. I was almost done for. When he came back to his senses and looked at the pavilion, Luo Fan's expression had become extremely grave. It must be known that if the power just now had been a little stronger, what awaited him would have been complete death, and his soul would have been dispersed, never to be reincarnated. At that time, all the traces he had left behind in the endless world would be completely erased. Even everything he had participated in and changed would be restored to normal. Countless worlds would have been reshuffled because of this. He couldn't help but feel fearful just thinking about such an outcome. Looks like I've been too full of myself. I thought that I had many layers of communication as my trump cards, and that I was almost immortal. I've already lost the fear that I should have. This thought emerged from the bottom of his heart in the next moment, causing his gaze to unknowingly become solemn. If not for today's encounter, Luo Fan would not have realized the change in his mentality. Now that he saw this clearly, he could not help but feel lingering fear. Thinking about it carefully, he did not know when it started, but he did not seem to have any scruples about death. In fact, when he was absorbing the information on the table, he even forcefully piled up his death. In the end, he spent countless trillions of deaths before he finally obtained a bit of information that could only be described as vague at that time. He did not think much of this method. In fact, he even faintly felt inexplicably satisfied and even proud that he was able to exchange so many deaths for this information. He felt satisfied and proud that his heart was firm and that his mind was perfect. However, now that he thought about it again, did he really not have any way to accept this information at that time? Could it be that he could only use the number of deaths to pile up the information? Obviously, the answer was no. Even now, with just a little thought, he could come up with all kinds of effective ways to safely receive this information. For example, he could create clones and project them. For example, he could refine some magic treasures that specialized in carrying information. For example, he could even use the light of heaven and earth to contain this information, and this was only the result of his current thoughts. If he continued to think about it carefully, based on the environment of the pavilion and the essence of the information, he would be able to come up with more options. However, at that time, he didn't think about this at all. After knowing that he could use death to achieve the final result, he didn't care about other possibilities at all. He just walked the path of death to the very end. From his point of view, this choice was a rather foolish one. There were simply too many things that could go wrong. Putting everything else aside, if the information contained some mysteries that he didn't understand and could cause damage to his mind that even the barrier between planes couldn't block, or could cause damage that couldn't be completely removed even if he used the connection between planes to recover, then it would be too late for him to regret now. And this kind of possible special damage was actually not a groundless worry. Instead, it was a type of injury that was highly likely to exist. Not to mention anything else, it didn't need to be too miraculous. As long as it had a little bit of the mysterious power that Luo Fan had encountered when he sat on the stone bench, it would be enough to make Luo Fan suffer. As he reflected on his various actions, Luo Fan's cold sweat had unknowingly drenched his clothes. Although it was quickly cleaned up by the power on his body, the appearance of the cold sweat was already enough to make him look battered and exhausted. I'm really lucky to be able to live until now. After a long time, he let out a long sigh, and his expression became inexplicably complicated. At this moment, the aura that faintly seeped out of his body had become more solid and purer. The faint feeling of faintness that was originally undetectable had unknowingly disappeared without a trace. And in his heart, he suddenly felt that his cultivation realm, which had not moved for a long time, seemed to have loosened a little. Evidently, although this process of reflection did not improve him by much, it had already made up for some of his previously undetectable weaknesses. Because these weaknesses had been made up for, his cultivation realm naturally had a feeling that it was going to rise, seeking enlightenment from the outside, and seeking inspiration is necessary. But similarly, seeking enlightenment from the inside is also indispensable. For a moment, an indescribable understanding appeared in his heart. With a slight thought, Luo Fan directly sat cross-legged in front of the pavilion and closed his eyes. He began to observe his soul from the extremely minute details and all of his thoughts in the depths of his heart. All of his thoughts, this discovery had already made him extremely vigilant. The experience just now made him realize that his attitude towards death had unknowingly become so impetuous, so contemptuous. However, Who could be sure that apart from this unknowingly planted weakness in his soul, there were no other weaknesses? Who could guarantee that his soul had already completely recovered to a perfect state? Obviously, no one, including Luo Fan himself, dared to make such a guarantee. Since that was the case, and since he had already thought of this possibility, Luo Fan, who had wholeheartedly pursued growth and self-perfection, naturally would not let go of this opportunity. Of course, he had to properly sort out his heart and sort out the various habits that he had unknowingly planted over the countless years. As for the traces of a true saint on this mountain, and the opportunity of perfecting the light of heaven and earth at its core, everything else was nothing compared to his own growth. Not to mention that it was just a delay. He would not even hesitate to completely give up this opportunity in order to understand his own body. Ever since Luo Fan stepped onto the path of cultivation, it had already been billions and trillions of years. In such a long period of time, the memories that he had accumulated and the traces that countless experiences had left on his soul had already reached a level that almost all living beings could not imagine if he wanted to thoroughly investigate everything, find out his own self, and find out his own truth. The complexity would be countless times more complicated than going through everything again. There is no need to mention how long it would take to do so. Just as Luo Fan was trying to understand his own soul, time passed year by year. Unknowingly, millions of years had passed. During these millions of years, Luo Fan did not move at all. Only an indescribable brilliance gradually seeped out of his body, enveloping the space-time within a radius of several dozen feet around his body. This caused the space-time within a radius of several dozen feet to be separated from the space-time of the outside world, forming two completely independent areas. The brilliance that emanated from his body was so mystical. Its essence was the purest, the most supreme, the most powerful, the most sacred, the most profound, and the most profound. Although its essence might be far inferior to the light of the world, even the faintly discernible light of the world actually showed signs of retreating when faced with this kind of brilliance, as if even the light of the world was unwilling to face this mysterious brilliance. Such a mystical light, even in this place on this extremely strange path, in front of this incomparably mystical pavilion, it still had a place of its own. No matter how the path and pavilion suppressed it, the brilliance did not waver. In fact, as time passed, it continued to expand outwards, bringing more and more areas into its range, causing the area that the brilliance enveloped to expand in an orderly manner in all directions. Vaguely, it even made people feel that the brilliance seemed to contain endless mysteries of the world, endless worlds, and endless space-time. Even if it was the purest, most supreme, most powerful, most sacred, and most profound, the feeling of endless existence hidden within it was not affected at all. On the contrary, it was because of these various mysterious feelings that the feeling of endless existence hidden within it became even more mysterious. Time continued to pass. By the time the brilliance released from Luo Fan's body had reached a radius of tens of thousands of feet, 30 million years had passed. On this day, the brilliance that had expanded to a radius of tens of thousands of feet quickly began to shrink. Although the brilliance had expanded to such a vast area, due to the obstruction of the pavilion, it could only expand in the opposite direction of the pavilion after reaching a certain point. In other words, it was expanding towards the path that led to the pavilion. As a result, the shrinking of the brilliance made people feel as if a tremendous suction force had suddenly appeared in the pavilion and began to frantically devour the mysterious brilliance that had spread to a radius of tens of thousands of feet. The scene looked rather strange. However, Luo Fan, who had released the brilliance, completely ignored all of this. At this moment, he slowly opened his eyes. When he opened his eyes completely, the brilliance that had expanded to a radius of tens of thousands of feet happened to enter his body, making him look like a very ordinary creature standing in front of the pavilion. However, compared to over 30 million years ago, the current Luo Fan's gaze had undergone a huge change. At this moment, his eyes were clear and bright, and the deep wisdom that originally existed in his eyes had been completely hidden. This made him look like a creature that had just been born and was observing the world with his own eyes for the first time. It was as if everything outside of himself was infinitely attractive to him, and he could find the joy that he wanted from it. So this is perfection, looking at his surroundings, feeling the omnipresent Tao presence, and experiencing the various beauties and emotions that he had previously neglected. Luo Fan thought to himself. Over the past 30 million years, he had thoroughly comprehended everything that he had experienced since he had stepped onto the path of cultivation. He had also thoroughly analyzed all the traces that remained on his soul. Through this comprehension and thorough analysis, he had discovered the weaknesses that his soul had developed over the course of countless trillions of years of cultivation, and he had eliminated and made up for them one by one. Before going through this comprehension and thorough analysis, he had never known that his soul actually had so many weaknesses, and that he had developed so many habits that could cause serious consequences once they erupted, leaving behind so many hidden dangers. However, although he was shocked and ashamed when he discovered these weaknesses and new interests, at the same time, the benefits that he brought after making up for these weaknesses and hidden dangers were also quite shocking. After all these repairs and making up for them, Luo Fan had already felt the feeling of perfection in his soul at this moment. At this moment, he only felt that his mind was incomparably lively. His originally formless spirit seemed to have turned into a ball of mysterious brilliance, as if it was constantly receiving all kinds of mysterious principles and mysterious insights from unknown places. In this indescribable state of perfection, the way he looked at everything around him had completely recovered to the purest and most compatible with himself. This kind of perspective allowed him to obtain countless information and mysteries from his surroundings at all times. Although he did not cultivate his cultivation or strength in the past 30 million years, his cultivation had already broken through its original bottleneck at some point in time, and he had taken a huge step forward from the level of a sixth tribulation expert. He could even vaguely sense the existence of his seventh tribulation. At the very most, it had only been 30 million years since he had passed the sixth tribulation. This period of time might be very long for ordinary cultivators, but for existences at Luo Fan's level, even for experts who had entered the tribulation, it was already a period of time that was not much longer than the blink of an eye. It should be noted that each level of the Tao Master Path represented the realm of a certain tribulation expert, and the time experienced by the cultivators in each level of the Tao Master Path was counted in trillions of years, or even billions of trillion years. Therefore, it could be seen how long it would take for an ordinary cultivator to cross a realm after entering the tribulation. In this way, in such a short period of time, he had fiercely pushed his cultivation realm to the point where he could even touch the seventh tribulation. This kind of progress could almost be regarded as heaven-defying. If it was before at this time, Luo Fan would probably feel that this kind of progress was just an accumulation of the past, and he would be disappointed that it would be difficult to find such a fast progress in the future. Chapter 2469. After changing his mentality, he looked at the pavilion in front of him again and felt that it had undergone an earth-shattering change. This pavilion naturally contained endless mysteries and principles. However, these mysteries and principles were incomprehensible to him now, or even to someone who had not become a true divine. Studying this pavilion here seemed to be guarding a treasure, but in reality, it was just a waste of time. Even if he spent billions of trillion years here, he would only be able to gain some superficial understanding. It was even better for him to understand his own heart and deepen his understanding and deduction from the principles that he had mastered at this moment. His eyes were like this, and the pavilion was already shrouded in a layer of fog. This layer of fog was none other than the manifestation of his understanding of the pavilion. This was because he clearly knew that the nature of this pavilion was simply illusory to him, and he could not come into contact with it. Hence, his consciousness naturally covered the pavilion with a layer of fog. Looking at the pavilion through this layer of fog, the pavilion became indistinct and illusory. It was even more illusory than the flowers in the mirror or the moon in the water. Looking at the stone table and stone stools in the pavilion, it was completely a ball of fog. If the fog above the pavilion was only a thin layer, and he could still see some details and outlines of the pavilion through this fog, then the fog on the stone table and stone stools in the center made it impossible for him to see what was inside the fog. Obviously, compared to the pavilion, the stone table and stone stools contained more mysteries that belonged to a true divine, and he could not understand them. Looking at this scene, Luo Fan could only sigh and shake his head. He looked at the fork in the path that he had previously ignored in front of the pavilion. It was a path that was slanted downwards and seemed to be continuously going deep into the mountain. On both sides, there were cliff-like mountain rocks gradually appearing. Compared to the other paths that were shrouded in fog, this path was obviously many times clearer. At every moment, there were all kinds of indescribable principles and mysteries that constantly flowed into Luo Fan's mind through his eyes. Normally, anyone who came here would have noticed this fork in the road. However, Luo Fan really didn't notice the existence of this fork in the road before. Previously, in his eyes, there was only the pavilion in front of him. There was only the stone table and the 4 stone stools in the pavilion. The existence of that fork in the road had been completely ignored by him. The reason for this was obviously because the trace left behind by the true divine was too strong, and it almost completely covered all other traces. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan directly stepped into the path with a calm expression. The moment he stepped into the path, he felt his body become light again. His entire body seemed to be washed by some kind of invisible force, and he felt like he was floating in the air, causing his body to float involuntarily. At this time, his light of heaven and earth was involuntarily separated from his body and appeared behind his head, forming a pure disk. It slowly rotated, constantly absorbing the information and mysteries around it. The light of heaven and earth uncontrollably separated from his body and appeared behind his head, forming a pure disk. It slowly rotated, constantly absorbing the information and mysteries around it. Also, this path was deliberately left empty by the true divine, so that it led directly to the center of the mountain, where the light of heaven and earth could be upgraded. Feeling this change, even if Luo Fan did not understand, he was afraid that this place had already been separated from the influence of the traces left by the true divine. Regarding this, Luo Fan was quite understanding. After all, those true divine were here to visit, not to fight their way to the door. Since they were here to visit, they naturally had to give face to the owner of the Tao Master's Path. As for the opportunity left here by the owner of the Tao Master's Path, it was not good to destroy it. Therefore, even if a mountain peak, a chaotic starry sky, and even a boundless dark region naturally appeared where they stood, they would not be able to move freely. However, in the end, they still could not completely submerge the opportunity. They could not prevent the later cultivators from entering the depths of the mountain and directly coming into contact with the opportunity. Moreover, leaving behind this path might be very troublesome for those who had not become true divine, but for the true divine, they did not even need to think about it to form it. In this way, it was natural for them to leave behind this path that led directly to the core. Of course, all of this was now only Luo Fan's own guess. Naturally, he could not be completely sure what would happen. At this moment, he lifted his foot and took a light step forward. His figure continued to move forward on this path. The deeper he went into this path, the more information and mysteries it contained, and the stronger the impact on the light of heaven and earth. Unknowingly, when Luo Fan had advanced tens of thousands of light years on this path, he found that his surroundings were already filled with an endless sea of information and mysteries. At this moment, the cliffs on both sides of the path that were only a few dozen feet away seemed to have retreated billions of light years, to the point that even Luo Fan had to widen his eyes to see clearly. Without all kinds of suppression, Luo Fan's speed was naturally very fast. To him, the distance of tens of thousands of light years was crossed in just a few dozen breaths. However, the more he moved forward, the greater the resistance in front of him. It was as if the endless information and mysteries themselves had some kind of resistance. As for his body, which had unknowingly floated up, it had already landed after advancing for a short while. At this time, in the light of heaven and earth behind his head, countless roots had already emerged and spread out of the light of heaven and earth. They began to wave in the void, constantly devouring and absorbing the endless information and mysteries around him, and constantly integrating these information and mysteries into the light of heaven and earth. With all these changes, the nature of the light of heaven and earth seemed to be constantly rising as he moved forward. The will of heaven and earth seemed to have returned to its mother's body, forming an invisible mass, constantly absorbing some kind of mysterious existence, and constantly promoting its own growth. After moving forward for thousands of light years with difficulty, the resistance in front of him finally increased to the extent that it was completely impossible for Luo Fan to move forward even half a step. At this time, the passage of time was several times longer than the distance of tens of thousands of light years at the beginning. It could be said that if Luo Fan did not have any other means, it could be said that this was already the limit of what he could achieve. This was also the case for him. It could be imagined that in the fifth level of the Tao Master's Road, there was no existence that could really cross this fork and go to the real core of this mountain, to the core position that could bring great opportunities to his light of heaven and earth. He did not know whether this result was due to the existence of this mountain, or because this place of opportunities was naturally set to be so difficult. Although Luo Fan did not expect this difficulty, he was not too surprised by it. If one wanted to obtain opportunities, they naturally needed to put in enough effort. At this moment, his heart moved slightly. His worldview of law had already linked up with his body, instantly causing some kind of indescribable change to occur in his body, causing him to almost completely become a manifestation of the worldview of law. With this change, he suddenly felt that the speed at which the surrounding information and mysteries surged into his body skyrocketed by dozens of times. Immediately afterward, the resistance that was originally so strong that he could not break through suddenly weakened by an unknown amount, causing him to feel his body become lighter again. He immediately stepped forward and continued to walk towards the core of this strange mountain. While his worldview of law was constantly absorbing the information and mysteries, it was also constantly breaking down the information and mysteries, extracting the information that had an impact on the worldview of law and completely erasing the useless ones. This information and mysteries were all-encompassing, and almost everything that existed in any world could be found in it. Such information and mysteries naturally had a lot of benefits to the worldview of law. It could give Luo Fan great inspiration on how to perfect and make up for the flaws in the worldview of law. In this way, as he continued to move forward, his worldview of law could not help but benefit more and more, and even vaguely seemed to have begun to produce some kind of subtle transformation. Unfortunately, even with the worldview of law, Luo Fan finally reached his limit after advancing for thousands of light years again. He once again felt that the resistance in front of him was so strong that he could not resist it at all. At this depth, even if he used all his strength, even if he used his concept God power, even if he pushed his worldview of law to the limit, it was impossible for him to advance even a small step. Sensing this scene, Luo Fan could only sigh inwardly. Immediately, with a thought, he no longer suppressed the world light. In an instant, it spread out and completely enveloped his entire body. In an instant, the resistance that was originally completely irresistible instantly weakened. Immediately afterward, he continued to move forward along the path against the world light. At this time, even with his eyesight, it was already difficult for him to see the cliffs on both sides that should have been several feet away. In this way, if it wasn't for his own sense of direction that was so strong that it would not waver even if the world was destroyed, he might not even know which direction was the right one to move forward in. After being isolated by the world light, Luo Fan could no longer directly absorb the endless information and mysteries of the outside world. If he wanted to, He could only receive the boundless information and mysteries of the light of heaven and earth through the light of heaven and earth. Obviously, the information and mysteries that the world light received were completely different from the information and mysteries that Luo Fan received. Not only were the types different, but even the nature of understanding and not understanding were also different. For the information and mysteries that he received, he did not even need to deduce much. He could naturally understand and comprehend them, and he could even integrate them into his body and turn them into his own. However, for the information that the world light received, he still could not understand it at all, even if he directly transferred the world light over. It felt as if he was directly facing the traces left behind by the true sage that he had seen in the pavilion previously. Because his mind had become pure and clear again, he instinctively covered it with a thick layer of fog at this time, making him feel as if he was receiving a strange fog when he looked over. What a pity! Upon discovering this, Luo Fan could not help but sigh inwardly. Although the development of this matter surprised him, it was not as if he could not understand it. After all, according to the information that he had obtained from the stone table, the opportunity in this position was prepared for the world light. For cultivators, this place clearly had great restrictions. Under such circumstances, it was already extremely rare for him to be able to advance for tens of thousands of light years before being stopped. Without Luo Fan dragging him down, the world light moved forward at a speed that was several times faster than before. During this process, the countless roots within the light of the world continued to spread out without any hesitation, reaching into the endless information and mysteries in the surroundings. They frantically absorbed the information and mysteries prepared for the light of the world into the main body of the light of the world. They either fused with the light of the world itself or fused with the invisible will of the world that had already turned into a ball. In the end, after hundreds of breaths had passed, and the light of the world had once again brought Luo Fan forward for tens of thousands of light years, an existence that was different from the endless information and mysteries before finally appeared in front of Luo Fan. It was a ball of strange light. It looked like a living thing, and its essence was incomparably pure and profound, as if it contained boundless heaven and earth, boundless light from the boundless world. World light. Upon seeing this, Luo Fan could not help but narrow his eyes. At first glance, this kind of light looked like a ray of world light. However, very soon, he overturned his previous judgment. This ball of light was not the true world light. In fact, its essence was not even light. The ball of light was actually formed from endless information and mysteries compressed and condensed together in an extremely mysterious way. It merely existed in the form of the world light. If compared to living beings, the world light was a real living being, while this ball of light was a living being formed from the accumulation of countless strange, tiny three-dimensional light spots. On the surface, it seemed the same, but its essence was worlds apart. It could not be considered the same kind of existence at all. Chapter 2470. Looking at the scene in front of him, Luo Fan was secretly shocked. How complicated, mysterious, and unbelievable was the light of heaven and earth. Even though he had condensed a ball of light of heaven and earth with his own efforts, he was still shocked. Constructing such an existence completely out of information and mysteries was so extravagant that it almost exceeded the limits of his imagination. After all, the information and mysteries contained within the light of heaven and earth were already something that he could not understand at all. Under such circumstances, if he wanted to construct the appearance of the light of heaven and earth with information and mysteries, he would need to include the endless information and mysteries contained within the normal light of heaven and earth. Apart from that, he would also need to include the countless information and mysteries that form the essence of the light of heaven and earth. Any one of these two things exceeded the scope of Luo Fan's understanding. How could he not be shocked when faced with such an existence? As expected of the light of heaven and earth. After a long time, Luo Fan sighed. With this sigh, he had a thought, and the light of heaven and earth that enveloped him slowly squeezed his body towards the information and mysteries in the appearance of the light of heaven and earth. At this point, the resistance that the light of heaven and earth encountered had already reached an unimaginable level. Even though it could still move, its speed was not much faster than squirming. In fact, it was even slower than a snail's movement. Although Luo Fan could already see the existence of the information and mysteries in the appearance of the light of heaven and earth, in reality, he was still extremely far away from them. If it squirmed at this speed, it would take an unimaginably long time. Perhaps there might not be much effect, even after thousands of years. Fortunately, this speed wasn't constant. As the light of heaven and earth absorbed the endless information and mysteries around it, the relationship between the light of heaven and earth and the information and mysteries around it seemed to become more and more harmonious. The resistance that was released by the information and mysteries also became smaller and smaller. In other words, the speed of the light of heaven and earth was increasing bit by bit. Compared to the increase in resistance, this speed of acceleration was obviously a little faster. In this way, the advantage would continue to accumulate. In the end, the time it would take for him to obtain the information and mysteries of the light of the world would be several times faster than he had expected. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan was not worried about it this time. Instead, he just quietly watched the waves of information and mysteries outside, watching the information and mysteries that were constantly changing like the light of heaven and earth in the center. Although he couldn't directly comprehend the information and mysteries, he was still qualified to comprehend the mysteries contained in the appearance of the light of heaven and earth condensed from the information and mysteries. Don't forget, although the quality of the light of heaven and earth was extremely high for him, to the point where he wasn't qualified to understand it, the quality of the light of heaven and earth was extremely high. However, no matter what, the condensation of the light of heaven and earth was single-handedly led by him. Since he was the one who started it, he naturally had some understanding of the various mysteries of the light of the world. This kind of understanding was enough to give him a lot of inspiration, allowing him to make great progress in all aspects. Due to his actions, his mind was naturally shrouded in a thin or thick fog that he couldn't comprehend. Gradually, it completely covered up everything else, allowing the form of the red light of the light of heaven and earth that he could comprehend to become even more prominent in his eyes. This made the traces of mysteries that were originally mixed up with countless other information and mysteries become unprecedentedly clear in his eyes. Wisps of understanding continuously emerged in his mind and gradually integrated into his worldview. In this way, in his eyes, he seemed to be in a boundless fog. Only the mysterious and unpredictable existence in front of him emitted a clear light that was different from the surrounding fog, allowing him to constantly receive indescribable understanding and make some kind of miraculous progress. At the same time, similar changes were occurring in many other layers at the same time. The information and mysteries related to the light of heaven and earth were obviously not limited to this layer of reality, but spread across endless layers. Moreover, the information and mysteries were equally mysterious and inconceivable no matter which level they were at. In other words, it also had the qualifications for the existence corresponding to Luo Fan to spend endless effort to comprehend all kinds of mysteries. As Luo Fan's many layers entered this state of comprehension at the same time, his perception of time gradually disappeared. Time flew by, and before he knew it, another 1,000 years had passed. During these 1,000 years, whether it was Luo Fan or the light of heaven and earth, both of them had made great progress. In comparison, the light of heaven and earth had obviously made greater progress. The invisible will of heaven and earth inside the light of heaven and earth had unknowingly grown to 10 times its original size during this process. Moreover, it faintly revealed an extraordinary aura that belonged to the will of heaven and earth that was several times stronger than before. The will of heaven and earth was an existence that was formed from the endless laws, mysteries, and principles of the world. It was even formed from the deep essence of everything. The level of such an existence was so high that it was not something that Luo Fan could understand at all. The aura that it gave off was also something that Luo Fan could not understand. At this moment, the extraordinary aura that the will of heaven and earth inside the light of heaven and earth gave off was getting closer and closer to the extraordinary aura that the light of heaven and earth gave off. In comparison, Luo Fan's aura was faintly discernible. His cultivation realm seemed to have improved a lot, and he seemed to be much stronger than before. However, on a deeper level, from the perspective of sensing, his perception of his seventh great tribulation did not deepen much because of this. Moreover, he had to confirm the exact time when the seventh tribulation would descend. Compared to the light of the heavens and earth, there was clearly a huge difference in the magnitude of this increase. However, at this moment, whether it was the light of heaven and earth or Luo Fan, they did not stop comprehending because of this. Instead, they were still immersed in that indescribable state. As for the light of heaven and earth's advancing speed, it had unknowingly broken away from the speed of a wriggling snail. It had increased to the speed of an ant. Although it still wasn't fast, it was already many times faster than when they first started. If it continued to advance at this speed, perhaps in less than 10 million years, the light of heaven and earth would truly come into contact with the information and mysteries that had taken on the form of the light of heaven and earth. Before seeing the information and mysteries that the core had taken on the form of the light of heaven and earth, there would not be any traces of the light of heaven and earth and the places that Luo Fan passed through. The information and mysteries remained the same after he passed through them. There were not even any thinner changes. However, at this moment, after he clearly saw the core information and the appearance of the mystery in the center, the situation had clearly changed drastically. It seemed that because the density of the information and mysteries in the surroundings had reached a certain stable state, when the light of heaven and earth frantically extracted the information and mysteries in the surroundings, the gaps formed by the extracted information and mysteries were not immediately filled up by the information and mysteries in the surroundings. Instead, after a long time, traces of information and mysteries slowly floated to the gaps and slowly filled up the traces that Luo Fan had left behind. In this way, as the light of heaven and earth continued to advance faster and faster, the traces behind him naturally became longer and longer. Now, after more than 1,000 years, the traces left behind by the light of heaven and earth had increased to a length of several dozen miles. It felt like a knife had ruthlessly slashed through the boundless information and mysteries. Evidently, Luo Fan did not care about this little change. At this moment, he only followed the original settings and carefully experienced the mysteries on the surface of the light of heaven and earth. He absorbed the various principles and mysteries that were helpful to him and integrated them into all aspects of his body. In this state where he could gain something at every moment, he probably would not care too much even if the world was destroyed, let alone the changes to the traces left behind by the light of heaven and earth. As the light of heaven and earth continued to advance, the traces left behind by the light of heaven and earth became longer and longer. Several dozen miles, 100 miles, a few hundred miles, 1,000 miles. Unknowingly, tens of thousands of years had passed. After these tens of thousands of years, the traces left behind by the light of heaven and earth had unknowingly reached a length of several million miles. A long trace trailed behind the light of heaven and earth, meandering and changing in the void like a ribbon, constantly drifting along with the fluctuations of the information and mysteries. At this moment, the light of heaven and earth had already brought Luo Fan to the information and mysteries of the light of heaven and earth, and was about to plunge into it. At this moment, Luo Fan came to a realization in his heart. This enlightenment woke him up from his extremely deep state of meditation, and he instantly broke away from the state of comprehending the information and mysteries of the light of heaven and earth. This enlightenment was none other than an indescribable sense of crisis. One was telling him that if he followed the light of heaven and earth into the information and mysteries of the light of heaven and earth, what awaited him would be assimilated by the endless information and mysteries. In the end, he would become a part of the light of heaven and earth. If he was lucky, he might become the same as the two balls of light that blocked the entrance outside the mountain peak. If he was unlucky, he might lose his sense of self forever, and the light of heaven and earth would completely stop here and turn into a vast cluster of worlds. Obviously, neither of the possibilities was what Luo Fan wanted to see. He had already considered the possibility of the former being lucky. Once he fell into that state, what awaited him would be becoming an incarnation of the light of heaven and earth. His will seemed complete, but in fact he was already completely controlled by the will of heaven and earth within the light of heaven and earth. This was naturally unbearable for him, who was pursuing his own transcendence and becoming a true sage. The latter was even more so if he was unlucky. The former might just be a change in his nature, and at least he could maintain a complete sense of self on the surface. However, the latter would completely integrate with the light of heaven and earth. In that case, his entire body would be integrated into the cluster of worlds that was formed by the light of heaven and earth, and he would not be much different from Pangu, who was said to be the embodiment of all things unless he was tired of living. There was no way he would do such a thing. In fact, it was this strong enough sense of danger that woke Luo Fan up from that state. After understanding the danger that he might encounter, Luo Fan did not hesitate to break away from the light of heaven and earth. He allowed the light of heaven and earth to rush forward and rush into the endless information and mysteries that were formed by the light of heaven and earth. Luo Fan himself stayed where he was, staying in the long, empty trace that the light of heaven and earth left in the process of passing through the endless information and mysteries. As he broke away from the protection of the light of heaven and earth, he instantly felt an indescribable pressure on his body and soul, causing him to feel an indescribable pressure from the bottom of his heart. Obviously, even in this area that was not filled with information and mysteries, he could still feel the pressure on his body and soul that was transmitted from the information and mysteries in the distance. Moreover, as time passed, this pressure continued to increase. According to this rate of increase, and at most 1,000 years, he would once again have to bear the terrifying pressure of the endless information and mysteries around him. In this place that was close to the core, if he did not have the protection of the light of heaven and earth, he would obviously end up in a worrisome situation in the face of this pressure. Realizing his current situation, Luo Fan could not help but frown slightly. With a slight thought, his worldview of laws appeared again and enveloped his body, trying to isolate the pressure of the information and mysteries from the outside world as much as possible. Squeak, squeak, squeak. At this moment, squeaking sounds came from the worldview of laws that he had conjured. Clearly, the pressure of the information and mysteries was also conjured in the face of the worldview of laws. However, compared to the faint light and shadow that the worldview of laws conjured, this pressure conjured some kind of strange sound. Chapter 2471. Transforming into sound can actually help me comprehend it? This thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind, and he only felt that it was inexplicable. However, he soon understood what was going on. In the process of transforming into sound, a considerable part of the information and mysteries had obviously been lost. This part was very likely to have taken away most of the information and mysteries that Luo Fan couldn't understand. In this way, the information and mysteries that had been transformed into sound had naturally become what he could comprehend after understanding this. Luo Fan no longer hesitated. He just wrapped his perception around the endless sound and continuously absorbed the information and mysteries contained in it that he could understand and that were helpful to him. These information and mysteries gradually converged into his mind, and he continuously distinguished and selected them. In the end, they turned into all kinds of things that were beneficial to him and completely integrated into his various aspects, promoting his growth in all aspects. In this process, his worldview of laws took over the pressure that his body had endured before. Under this pressure, his worldview of laws was like a piece of iron that was being forged on a chopping board. Although he had to endure astonishing pain, he was constantly reaping some kind of indescribable benefit. His worldview of laws seemed to be undergoing some kind of subtle change every moment. In this process, time passed quickly. Before he knew it, hundreds of years had passed. At a certain moment, a fixed feeling awakened Luo Fan from that kind of indulgence. He looked around and found that the space around him had shrunk a lot compared to hundreds of years ago. However, compared to what he had originally guessed, it seemed to have shrunk by several times. What's going on? Luo Fan was slightly taken aback. After careful observation, he finally understood what was going on. It turned out that in front of him, the information and mysteries that had turned into the light of heaven and earth had produced an incomparably powerful attraction towards the endless information and mysteries of the outside world. This attraction pulled the endless information and mysteries in the surroundings into the information and mysteries of the central core, constantly converging towards the place that seemed to be the light of heaven and earth. It was precisely because of this that the information and mysteries had focused on the central core in the past hundreds of years, leaving only a few things that acted on the gap that Luo Fan was in at this moment. In other words, because most of the information and mysteries had not had time to exert their strongest pressure on the gap and on Luo Fan, they had already been pulled over by the information and mysteries that had turned into the light of heaven and earth, completely merging with the light of heaven and earth. As a result, the pressure it exerted on the gap was much smaller than usual, and the gap wasn't shrinking as fast as usual. After discovering this, Luo Fan finally relaxed. He no longer cared about the consequences that he might encounter after the gap disappeared. He only focused on his perception and his comprehension on the information and mysteries that had appeared in the surroundings, comprehending the various principles and mysteries contained within, and absorbing the various aspects that were beneficial to him. Time passed slowly. 100 years, 1,000 years were just an instant. In the blink of an eye, tens of thousands of years had passed. After tens of thousands of years, even though the gap had shrunk many times slower than before, by this time, the gap had already shrunk to a small area that only wrapped around Luo Fan's body. As for the traces of the gap that had originally been so long that it could even be calculated in tens of thousands of miles, it had already completely disappeared without a trace. At this moment, Luo Fan finally recovered from that inexplicable state of comprehension. The moment he opened his eyes, an indescribable light of comprehension flashed through his eyes. The aura on his body was released slightly, but it was instantly retracted, allowing his body to return to its original state, which was that of a mortal. Compared to before, his aura was much more tenacious and condensed. It seemed that his essence had been improved. Just this gaze and aura alone was enough to tell how much Luo Fan had improved over the past tens of thousands of years. Luo Fan did not pay much attention to all of this. At this moment, he only focused on the information and mysteries that were getting closer and closer to him. In the end, they were only a few dozen feet away from him. However, compared to his previous attitude that was filled with caution, the current him had already become extremely indifferent in the face of some information and mysteries. Of course, this was not because his improvement was so great that it allowed him to ignore the power that he could not resist at all tens of thousands of years ago. Instead, it was because as the information and mysteries in the center drew in the endless drifting information and mysteries in the surroundings, the density of the information and mysteries around him had unknowingly fallen to a level that he could endure. In fact, this was the fundamental reason why Luo Fan woke up from that state of immersion in comprehension. When these information and mysteries were transformed into sound, they had already lost a lot of them. Therefore, once the information and mysteries themselves had fallen to the level that Luo Fan could comprehend, then the various mysteries that remained after the information and mysteries were transformed into sound had already been reduced to almost nothing. And for Luo Fan, who had been immersed in it, This clearly meant that he no longer had the qualifications to comprehend it. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan returned to his senses at this moment and realized that the gap around his body had already shrunk to this extent. It's a pity that there's still too little time in the end. Looking at this scene, Luo Fan could not help but sigh inwardly. It could be said that if he had a little more time and had more information for him to comprehend, he was even confident that he could advance further and even sense the specific time when the seventh great calamity would descend. However, it was obvious that the truth was not as he wished. In the end, the information and mysteries were still limited, and in the end, they could not bring him endless benefits with a slight thought. He lifted his foot and took a light step forward. His figure had already crossed the gap, and he directly entered the endless information and mysteries around him. As he entered it, the pressure that the surroundings could originally withstand instantly skyrocketed by more than 10 times. The moment the pressure skyrocketed, he felt his body collapse, as if his entire body was being crushed in an instant. If it were an ordinary living being, this kind of injury that their bodies were instantly crushed would be enough to kill them. However, for Luo Fan, this kind of injury was only the same as losing a strand of his hair. Therefore, in the next moment, with a slight thought, his body that had been crushed into countless tiny pieces had already been glued together again, and he seemed to have completely returned to normal. Moreover, because the pressure had already seeped into his body, it made Luo Fan's body feel a little more familiar with this power. This improvement caused his body to be able to endure the pressure for a little longer. Next, Luo Fan did not leave, nor did he return to the gap. Instead, he continued to resist the boundless pressure around him with his body, allowing his body to collapse and reform again and again under the pressure. During this process of collapse and reassembly, his body and everything else was being strengthened and upgraded over and over again. It could be said that at this moment, Luo Fan could almost be considered to be using the endless information and mysteries around him to temper his body, his power, and everything else. During this process, time passed quickly. Several years later, a strange sound rang out behind him, awakening Luo Fan, who was immersed in this strange body-tempering state. He turned around to take a look, only to find that the small gap behind him had completely collapsed and disappeared under the pressure of the endless information and mysteries. At this moment, there was only endless information and profundities left behind him. Seeing this, Luo Fan sighed, and he faintly felt like he had nowhere to rely on. After all, the existence of the gap was a comfort to him. It meant that he had a path of retreat to escape danger any time. This path of retreat was enough for him to escape danger when he felt that he couldn't bear it anymore. Even if he thought that he could already bear the pressure and no longer felt danger because of it, he still felt at ease because he had this path of retreat. In this way, the disappearance of the path of retreat naturally had an impact on him. Fortunately, this impression wasn't too big. Soon, Luo Fan got rid of all kinds of distracting thoughts, and his body and mind returned to a perfect state. At this moment, he had completely removed the defensive layer of the worldview materialization on his body. In other words, the current Luo Fan wasn't tempering himself in the information and mysteries of the worldview, but he was directly using his own body to receive the endless information and mysteries, bear the pressure, and use this pressure to temper himself. It was also because of this that he could still temper himself in the world of information and mysteries at this moment. One must know that as time passed, the information and mysteries around him decreased compared to before. Over the years, the effects of this tempering should have decreased. But now, this tempering effect still existed. This was obviously because Luo Fan had used some kind of method to strengthen this effect. However, this was clearly the end. The pressure produced by the information and mysteries around him had made Luo Fan feel less and less pressure. Even now, although he was still enduring the pressure of the endless information and mysteries, his body could already barely withstand it. In other words, the signs of his body collapsing into powder had completely disappeared. This undoubtedly saved him a lot of suffering. But at the same time, it also greatly reduced the tempering effect that he wanted. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan could only sigh inwardly. He immediately turned his head and looked around. When he looked behind him, he had already faintly seen the end of the information and mysteries. And this was something that he couldn't see at all before this. Even though the edge was still extremely far away, he could still see it. Compared to before, the ocean of information and mysteries had clearly shrunk by many times. Looking around again, there was still endless information and mysteries. As for the mountain cliffs that should have existed, they were still not clearly visible. If Luo Fan hadn't come down from above, he would have suspected whether there were any mountain cliffs around him. Looking ahead, there was only a boundless fog. The fog enveloped the world's light and mysteries, and Luo Fan couldn't even clearly see the outline of the information and mysteries. He couldn't recognize the mysteries contained within that made even the world's light scramble for them. This fog was obviously not real. It was a manifestation of Luo Fan using his eyes to shield himself from the various things that he couldn't comprehend. Furthermore, the fact that it was so thick that not even the outline of the information and mysteries could be seen clearly meant that the mysteries contained within the information and mysteries were many times stronger than before. Looking at all this, Luo Fan didn't change his perspective so that he could truly see the information and mysteries behind the fog. Instead, he turned the wooden tube around, looking at the endless information and mysteries outside the fog. In fact, compared to the information and mysteries in the world's light and mysteries in front of him, the fog contained within the endless information and mysteries around him was only sporadic. At a glance, it even gave off a feeling that they were small islands in the ocean of information and mysteries. Faced with this situation, it was many times easier for Luo Fan to comprehend the endless information and mysteries around him than before. Therefore, at this moment, he completely focused on it, wholeheartedly fusing with the endless information and mysteries around him. He continuously absorbed the endless nutrients within and seized the various things that were beneficial to him. Among them, there were many things that he had comprehended when he passed by previously. However, at the same time, there were some things that were rather unfamiliar to him, and it was his first time comprehending them. After all, he didn't stop for long when he passed by previously, and his comprehension of the information and mysteries was only on the surface. Compared to using all his effort to comprehend it this time, it was obviously much worse. Now, that he could discover the things that he hadn't discovered before, it was only natural. Amidst this comprehension, the flow of time seemed to no longer exist. Chapter 2472. This soft sound awakened Luo Fan from his inexplicable state. He looked toward the source of the sound, only to see that the central core had already transformed into the light of heaven and earth. At this moment, the information and mysteries had already stopped absorbing the boundless and drifting information and mysteries. It stopped. Seeing this scene, Luo Fan's eyes flashed, and a trace of doubt flashed in his heart. The drifting information and mysteries still existed. He hadn't even retrieved them all, so how did it end? At that moment, he felt a strong tremor pass through some mysterious channel to his heart. In this tremor, he vaguely felt that an existence that had an extremely close connection with him was undergoing some kind of transformation that he couldn't immediately sense. Immediately after, a ball of light suddenly flew out from the information and mysteries that had transformed into the light of heaven and earth. This was none other than his light of heaven and earth. This ball of light of heaven and earth had now turned into a light cocoon, and it seemed to have become an extremely ordinary light. When it broke away from the information and mysteries that had transformed into the light of heaven and earth, it was as if there was some kind of unimaginably terrifying power pushing the light of heaven and earth away from the central core of the information and mysteries, causing it to accelerate faster and faster. Luo Fan's current position was originally next to the core. In just a short while, the light of heaven and earth flew out and arrived in front of him. Even though Luo Fan tried his best to stop, the light of heaven and earth did not stop at all and ruthlessly smashed into his body. Fortunately, the light of heaven and earth was condensed by Luo Fan himself, and it had an extremely close and mysterious connection with him. After smashing into his body, it immediately spread out and wrapped around his body. Not only did it not cause him any harm, but also made him feel all sorts of indescribable information and mysteries constantly pouring into his soul. In a trance, he seemed to have comprehended something and even obtained some sort of indescribable transformation. This feeling was so strange and mysterious. At this moment, Luo Fan was completely immersed in it. He no longer had any interest in what was happening in the outside world. At that moment, the light of heaven and earth enveloped his body and rushed out along with the external force that came out of nowhere. Light and shadow constantly flickered in the surroundings. In front of Luo Fan, where the light of heaven and earth flew out, endless information and mysteries seemed to have been detonated at this moment. They began to frantically roll and pounce after the light of heaven and earth. Even if all the worlds were piled up in front of him, they wouldn't be able to slow him down in the slightest. As the light of heaven and earth brought Luo Fan flying backward, the information and the mystery kept advancing. In the end, when the light of heaven and earth brought Luo Fan back to the entrance of the fork, the front was completely blocked by endless information and mysteries, completely restored to the state before he entered. Even at this moment, the light of the heavens and earth didn't stop. The external force that was affecting the light of the heavens and earth didn't reduce at all. Instead, it continued to push the light of the heavens and earth outward. The fork, the pavilion, the road in front of the pavilion, the fog that blocked the entrance to the road, the vast and boundless void produced by the fight between the two groups of light, the outer layer of the void that was only a thin layer inside, but seemed to be boundless inside, the chaotic starry sky, the light curtain, and the boundless darkness. Finally, it brought Luo Fan straight out of the twisted point of the boundless darkness and back to the depths of an abyss on a continent in the forbidden area of the fifth layer of the town master's path. At this point, Luo Fan, who was in a trance and seemed to be transforming along with the light of heaven and earth, suddenly came to his senses. Everything that had happened previously flashed through his mind, allowing him to understand everything that had happened in the blink of an eye. He had even deduced how all of this had happened. It seems that this is not a one-time opportunity, but an opportunity that can be given to many people. This thought flashed through his mind. At that moment, the external force that the light of heaven and earth suffered was obviously exerted on him by the core of information and mysteries in some indescribable way. It could even be said that this was the rules set by the true saint who had set up this opportunity. This meant that he had completely obtained the opportunity, and it also meant that he was no longer qualified to stay in it. His heart slightly moved, and he looked down at the distortion below, wanting to enter it. However, an indescribable resistance directly acted on his light of heaven and earth, making it impossible for the light of heaven and earth to approach the distortion, let alone enter it and go to the mountain, the place of opportunity. As expected, sensing the irresistible resistance, Luo Fan could not help but sigh. He did not continue with such a futile attempt. At this moment, his heart slightly moved, and an indescribable expression appeared on his face. There was a flash of surprise in his eyes. I didn't think that I would really make a breakthrough. When he examined himself, he discovered that his cultivation realm had actually made quite a huge breakthrough compared to before. At the very least, he could already sense that his seventh great tribulation would happen on a certain day in 70 trillion years. This period of time was naturally extremely long. Even for an existence at Luo Fan's level, it was definitely not a short time. Such a long period of time also meant that he was still quite a distance away from being able to trigger the seventh great tribulation. However, no matter how long it was, it at least meant that he had already broken through the final bottleneck to the seventh great tribulation. This meant that he could clearly sense the exact time when the seventh great tribulation would descend. This also meant that his cultivation realm had taken a huge step forward compared to before, when he could only vaguely sense the existence of the seventh Great Tribulation. One must know that it had only been tens of millions of years since he passed through the sixth Great Tribulation. In such a short period of time, he was already able to break through the bottleneck to the next level, and he only needed time to reach the point of breakthrough. The speed of improvement was so fast that even he felt it was a little unbelievable. It's indeed a powerful opportunity, not only for the light of heaven and earth, but also for the cultivators. At this moment, he turned around to look at the distorted place that led to the boundless darkness. An indescribable expression appeared on his face. Various thoughts flashed through his mind. He lifted his foot and took a step forward. In the blink of an eye, he had already left the abyss and the continent where the abyss was located. When he looked down, he saw a cultivator sitting cross-legged beside the abyss, cultivating with his eyes closed. That cultivator was not the cultivator who had been waiting for his Tao partner to come out. Instead, it was the cultivator whom Luo Fan had saved from the chaotic stars, the cultivator whose light of heaven and earth had turned into this abyss. At this moment, because Luo Fan did not conceal his existence, the cultivator instantly discovered his existence. His eyelids trembled, and he opened his eyes in the blink of an eye. His eyes were like two stars that flickered with an extremely profound light as he looked at Luo Fan. The moment he saw Luo Fan, the cultivator was overjoyed. He quickly got up and waved his hand. The abyss below turned into a ball of light of heaven and earth that directly flew to the back of his head. With a slight turn, all the cold air disappeared, and the light of heaven and earth turned into pure light. At this moment, the cultivator arrived before Luo Fan and bowed to Luo Fan. He said, "Thank you for saving my life, ruler. I didn't know your identity before, so I offended you. Please forgive me, ruler." Evidently, this cultivator had already regarded Luo Fan as the ruler of this forbidden zone. He believed that Luo Fan's status had far surpassed most of the other cultivators on the fifth floor. Hearing this, Luo Fan only smiled. "I've already said all this before, so there's no need to say it again. Instead, I have to thank you for guarding this place for so long." The cultivator hurriedly waved his hand. "Ruler, you don't actually need my protection. I'm just expressing my gratitude. Since you've come out, I'll take my leave." Hearing this, Luo Fan smiled. "There's no need to leave now. I found something down below, and I plan to open up a land of opportunity here. If you're interested, perhaps you could try again." When he heard this, the cultivator was slightly taken aback. When he looked at Luo Fan, his gaze was blank, but it quickly turned into one of disbelief. There was something special down below. He could not be any more certain about this. If this special place was an extremely rare opportunity, he would at most be envious of Luo Fan's luck. He would not find it all that inconceivable. However, at this time, Luo Fan actually wanted to open up this place into a land of opportunity and make it public to others. This had completely subverted his worldview. He couldn't understand it at all, and there was only a feeling of disbelief in his heart. "Dare I ask, ruler, if my guess is correct, are you planning to open up this place to the public?" he asked in disbelief. Luo Fan only smiled. "Of course, this isn't a one-off opportunity. Instead, it's something that many cultivators can accept. It's obvious that this is a place of opportunity for all living beings. I can't let this pearl continue to be covered in dust." At this time, the cultivator was convinced of his guess, and his eyes couldn't help but flash with an incomparably bright light. He kowtowed to Luo Fan and said, "The ruler's spirit is great, and no one can compare to it." Luo Fan faintly smiled, but he did not take this cultivator's excitement to heart, as he almost lost his composure. Perhaps the cultivator did admire Luo Fan's boldness, but at this moment his excitement were mostly because Luo Fan was going to open up the place of opportunity in the distortion below. This would give him a chance to see the place of opportunity that had imprisoned him in the starry sky for who knew how many billions of years. However, although he knew this, he did not care. After all, this was simply human nature. Even if the cultivator was a little impressed by Yi Chen's actions, It was only admiration at most. What could make the cultivator excited was definitely something related to himself. At this moment, Yi Chun simply said to the cultivator, "Stand to the side. Wait for me to cast a great technique." As he spoke, he raised his hand and grabbed at the void of a continent below. There were also countless living beings on this continent, and there were even intelligent living beings among these living beings. They had even formed various civilizations, causing this continent to be quite prosperous. At this moment, when Luo Fan raised his hand and grabbed at the continent, an invisible hand directly grabbed the main body of the continent, causing the various subtle operations on the continent to suddenly come to a halt. It was easy to imagine the inertia produced by the sudden stop of operations that had lasted billions of years. In that instant, countless living beings on the continent swayed left and right, and countless people fell to the ground. Even if Luo Fan did not intend to destroy the countless living beings on it, just this action alone had already caused an unknown number of living beings to die a violent death. Due to this change, an entire society did not need to change too much. As long as there were synchronized changes, it could cause a huge disaster. Even if it was a change that suddenly made all living beings sway and did not seem to have much lethality, it was enough to cause such a disaster. However, Luo Fan clearly did not care about all of this. At this moment, he casually clenched his hand, and boundless power flashed by. Under the effect of this power, the huge continent that was grabbed by the invisible hand began to undergo various indescribable changes. The entire continent completely melted at this moment, turning into a large mass of matter that could not be described with words. The structure of this mass of matter was extremely mysterious and profound. Everything in it, including all living beings and things that could not have changed at all, seemed to have completely melted from the outside and turned into a part of this mass of matter that could not be described with words. However, inside the mass of matter, everything existed as normal as it was not long ago. The living beings that should be alive were still alive, the mountains and rivers that should be here are still here, and the various mysterious sceneries that should be here were also still in that mysterious state. Everything was as if nothing had happened. Seeing this change, even the cultivator could not help but show a look of surprise at this moment. Chapter 2473. Luo Fan naturally did not care about the cultivator's shock. To the cultivator at the side, this incredible method was as easy and natural as flipping his palm for him. At this moment, he did not even pay much attention to the changing continent. Instead, he focused more of his attention on the distortion below the continent. That's right, the distortion had already appeared below the continent and was no longer in the center. After all, at this moment, the entire continent had already been taken out by Luo Fan. After focusing his attention on the distortion, there were no longer many secrets about it in his heart. After making some calculations in his heart, he knew how to transform the distortion into what he wanted. As his thoughts turned, his perception slowly seeped into the distortion. The distortion rejected him greatly because of the existence of the information and mysteries, but it did not reject everything about him. It only rejected his light of the world and himself, which was closely connected to the light of the world. As for the senses that he released, as long as he could get rid of some of the characteristics that belonged to the light of heaven and earth, he would not be rejected by the information and mysteries, and he would be able to enter the distortion. As his perception entered, something in the boundless darkness suddenly began to tremble slightly. It began to accelerate towards the location of his perception. The speed of that existence was extremely astonishing. In just a few dozen breaths' time, he had already traversed an unknown distance and arrived at the location that he had sensed. It was none other than the sailboat that Luo Fan had created in the darkness with the help of the darkness information and the darkness main body. Back then, this capsized boat was placed in front of the light screen at the end of the darkness by Luo Fan. The last time he steered the boat to that location, it took him hundreds of years. This time, not only did the sailboat return to its starting point, but it also sailed against the current. However, it only took a few dozen breaths before it reached its goal. From this, it was enough to see how much progress Luo Fan had made compared to before. After summoning the boat back, Luo Fan's heart moved again. His perception rushed into the boundless darkness below, and in the blink of an eye, it completely merged with the darkness. The moment his perception merged with it, the boundless darkness began to surge violently. Countless strange changes appeared around Luo Fan's perception. Endless attacks crazily pounced on Luo Fan's perception, wanting to completely crush his perception and completely integrate everything contained in his perception into the darkness. In the face of such darkness, if it was before Luo Fan, who did not obtain the information and the mysterious opportunity, would definitely be at a loss. Even if he did not cut off his perception and give up, he would still need to use some methods and pay a huge price to escape. However, this was not the case at this moment. In the face of the boundless darkness, his perception also began to undergo countless changes. In the blink of an eye, they seemed to have turned into endless information and mysteries, shuttling back and forth among the endless changes that the boundless darkness had evolved. They constantly avoided the important and focused on the trivial, and in an extremely mysterious manner, they easily bypassed the countless changes and directly disintegrated the various evolutions of the darkness. Immediately afterward, after disintegrating the various evolutions of the darkness, his perception began to move further, indirectly mobilizing the darkness below, gradually changing its shape. Vaguely, it formed a strange, solid port, a port where the boat stopped. This port was in a semicircle. Around it, a semicircle of solid black matter enveloped the port. The semicircle of solid black matter was none other than the boundless darkness below that was mobilized by Luo Fan's perception. Its essence was also boundless darkness, but its repulsive effect on living creatures was stronger. Its repulsive effect on matter was also stronger. Originally, when all matter was thrown into the darkness, it would directly entangle it, and according to the characteristics of the matter thrown into it, it would evolve various corresponding changes to resist that matter. However, at this time, the darkness that had turned into a solid was different. This solid darkness that had turned into a solid repelled all matter and all living creatures. After any matter or living creature fell into it, the first response it would make was to repel it, so that those creatures could only appear on the surface of the solid darkness. In this way, it seemed that the darkness had turned into a solid substance and could support the existence of living creatures and matter. Immediately afterwards, Luo Fan's perception spread out once again, following the darkness, starting from the port, and continuing to spread towards the end of the darkness. In the process of spreading, a river of darkness gradually took shape. This river extended from the port all the way to the light screen at the end of the darkness. Within a certain range on both sides of the river, the darkness seemed to become more turbulent and had a faster flow speed. If there was a matter floating on it, it would be able to reach the end of the darkness at a faster speed. At the intersection of the river and the darkness outside, there was an invisible barrier that separated the two sides. This barrier made the turbulent darkness and the calm darkness outside not interfere with each other, and they were incompatible. Any creature or substance that wanted to break through this barrier would need to possess great power and pay a great price in order to do so. Originally, it would take 100 years to reach the end of this path, but now, Luo Fan was able to directly transform it into a river that was neither too big nor too small with his perception from a distance. If someone who knew of Luo Fan's means saw this, they would definitely be dumbfounded and find it unbelievable. However, this was already a completely natural method for Luo Fan. In fact, this was not the end of his power. At this moment, his perception had already arrived in front of the light curtain along the river. It directly penetrated the light curtain and emitted all kinds of strange fluctuations that directly swept across the boundless, chaotic, starry sky. Just like that, after waiting for a long time, a divine dragon came from the boundless, chaotic, starry sky and came directly in front of him. This divine dragon was none other than the living creature that he had constructed with the information contained in the chaotic starry sky and the main body of the chaotic starry sky. It was also the living creature that had carried him to the mountain back then. Previously, this living creature had been playing in the world created by the aftermath of the battle between the two balls of light. At this moment, when it heard Luo Fan's perception calling, it directly crossed over and returned to the place where it was born. For ordinary living creatures, it was naturally quite difficult to move freely in the chaotic starry sky, and they would have to pay a huge price. However, for this divine dragon that was condensed from the information of the chaotic starry sky and the main body of the chaotic starry sky, the situation was obviously completely different. For the divine dragon, the chaotic starry sky was its home, its mother, and the closest place to it. If it wanted to move here, it would even be easier than ordinary cultivators in the normal world. Not only would it not be obstructed, but it could even be strengthened. It was precisely because of this that it could be so fast. Of course, this was also because the divine dragon had made a lot of progress after being born for so long. Seeing that the divine dragon had returned, Luo Fan's heart moved. His perception trembled slightly, and a large amount of information was directly poured into the divine dragon, allowing it to understand a lot in an instant. Afterward, the divine dragon let out a dragon roar and directly coiled in front of the light curtain, beginning to fall into a deep sleep. Of course, in the process of slumber, the divine dragon was also constantly absorbing the endless chaotic starry sky around it, constantly absorbing the endless gray existence into its body, constantly nurturing and strengthening its body, its own power, and even its own essence. In this way, everything inside is completed. In the future, if living creatures come here, they will naturally be able to come here through the sailboat and then go to that mountain through the divine dragon. Sensing that the divine dragon was completely obeying his orders, Luo Fan smiled slightly and thought to himself, in reality, reaching this step, the cultivators who wanted to obtain the divine dragon in the future had actually only completed the first step. It did not mean that they would definitely obtain the divine dragon's information and mysteries. However, with this first step, everything else had nothing to do with Luo Fan. Giving them this kind of opportunity to obtain the divine dragon was already very kind of him. Was he really going to send them completely to where the divine dragon was and let them directly absorb the endless information and mysteries? Although Luo Fan was willing to comply with the considerations of the true sage who had created this land of divine dragon and make this divine dragon's opportunity public, he was not to the point of pestering others to directly give the divine dragon, helping them step on the right track and opening the right path to seek the divine dragon's opportunity was already giving them face. If they really wanted to obtain the divine dragon's opportunity, they would have to go to that world to search for it. They would have to search for it in the void, compete with that ball of light, compete with other competitors, and accept the test given by the true sage. If they did not have this ability, then they could forget about the divine dragon's opportunity. As these thoughts flashed through his mind, Luo Fan, who had already consumed most of his perception, retracted it. After going through all kinds of tempering in the distortion, this retracted perception seemed to be slightly more condensed than before, as if it had obtained some benefits. Regarding this, Luo Fan only smiled faintly and did not take it to heart. Although this kind of perception had obtained some benefits, it was too insignificant and was not enough to move him at all. Moreover, compared to all of his perception, this little bit of perception was probably not even 1 in a trillion. Under such circumstances, this little bit of benefit was distributed to him, and he could not even feel it. So how could he be tempted? As for sending all of his perception to undergo the same tempering, although it was possible, the gains obviously did not make up for the losses. With so many senses, it would probably take millions of years to temper them bit by bit. Using so much time to obtain this little bit of improvement in perception was obviously far from using other methods to cultivate. Just as his perception was creating a path in the distortion that led to the mountain outside the distortion, Luo Fan had already succeeded in the transformation of the continent. At this moment, the continent had already been transformed into a tall tower by him. It was a tower with 999 floors. However, the tower was not standing upright in the boundless light, but it was standing upside down in the light of the forbidden land. The tip of the tower just happened to be inserted into the distortion, directly connecting to the solid darkness that Luo Fan had previously constructed. In other words, if someone could go all the way down from the highest point, pass through the 999 floors, and take another step, they would naturally enter the distortion, arrive at the dark port, and directly see the sailboat that was heading towards the land of opportunity. In the process, the living beings living on the original continent had also been unknowingly scattered to the 999 floors. The whole process was so natural that even the cultivators among them did not notice this change. They only knew that at a certain moment, the truth of the world was revealed to them, making them suddenly realize that they were not on a complete continent, but one of the many layers of continents. After the tower took shape, Luo Fan's heart moved slightly, and the endless light around him continuously poured into the tower. In the blink of an eye, it had already fused with everything in the tower and started to seep into it, becoming the core of all matter and living beings, causing the tower and everything in it to fuse with the forbidden land outside. This fusion was not enough to make the tower and everything on the continent in existence that could not be destroyed, but it made it a detonation point. It became a detonation point that caused the boundless light to riot. If a living being caused enough damage to the tower's continent, it would trigger a riot in the boundless light outside. In the end, countless rays of light would pour into the tower's continent, completely destroying it. At the same time, it would also destroy the living being that caused all of this. According to Luo Fan's estimation, even a cultivator who had formed the embryonic form of the world's light would not be able to get away with this kind of destruction. Perhaps their body and mind would directly collapse, and they would be completely erased. Even if they were lucky, they would also cause great damage to their own world's light, and it would take countless years to recover completely. Chapter 2474. After setting up the 999 floors of the Continental Tower, he casually pointed with his finger, and countless spiritual lights descended on each floor of the continent, directly fusing with the existence on each floor of the continent. As the rays of light descended and fused, all sorts of subtle changes appeared on the continents. Some kind of danger zone suddenly appeared out of thin air. Some kind of restriction suddenly appeared. Some kind of strange treasure suddenly appeared. And some kind of strange creature suddenly began to take shape. Almost all opportunities and trials were present on the continent of the High Tower. This should be enough. Looking at this scene, Luo Fan's heart flashed with this thought, and he could not help but show a faint smile on his face. Seeing his smile, the eyes of the cultivator who had been standing to the side lit up. He wanted to ask Luo Fan if he had already arranged the land of opportunity, but he felt that the timing was not right. It seemed that it was not a good time to ask, so he seemed a little hesitant. At this time, Luo Fan had already retracted his palm. He stood with his hands behind his back and said, "The arrangement of this land of opportunity has been completed. What you can get from there will depend on your ability and luck." After speaking, he ignored the cultivator and turned to leave. He did not directly announce to all the cultivators on the 5th floor that there was a land of opportunity waiting for them here. He just ignored it after setting up the land of opportunity. As for which cultivators would be able to find this place, and which cultivator would be able to obtain the opportunity, it would depend on their luck. Of course, there was no need to worry that no one would find this place. For cultivators, as long as they could increase their cultivation realm and take one step closer to becoming a true sage, they would do anything. This was a land of fortune placed directly here. As long as a trace of it leaked out, there would definitely be countless cultivators who would come here to explore. Perhaps there would even be all sorts of killings and bloodshed. As for whether there would be any trace of it, that was even more so. As long as it existed, there would definitely be traces. Just like the distortion below, it was hidden so deeply, but in the end, it was still found by Luo Fan due to all sorts of traces. Similarly, Since this 999-story upside-down pagoda continent existed here, there would inevitably be traces of it leaked out, and it would eventually become an open secret among the cultivators. Whether Luo Fan had publicly transmitted his voice to all living beings or not, it was only a matter of time before he was discovered. For an existence at Luo Fan's level, time was an existence that did not have much meaning. Tens of millions of years, hundreds of trillions of years, to them, were nothing. Hearing Luo Fan's words and seeing Luo Fan leave, the cultivator hurriedly bowed toward Luo Fan and thanked Luo Fan for his kindness. After Luo Fan left, he no longer hesitated and directly plunged into the top floor of the 999-story tower below. The topmost layer looked like a complete continent. The entire continent looked like a complete world. Looking in all directions from here, it looked like a normal world. He could not see the endless light outside at all, nor could he see the 999 floors of land below. As soon as he descended on this continent, the cultivator instantly felt various invisible suppressive forces suddenly covering his body. The suppressive force was so mysterious that even though he had the light of the world, he could not withstand it. In an instant, he felt that more than 99% of his strength had been completely suppressed. Right now, the strength he could exert was at most at the innate Grand Luo realm. The feeling of his strength being suddenly suppressed was an extremely novel experience for him. After all, not everyone was like Luo Fan, who encountered a tribulation that suppressed his own strength every once in a while. For the vast majority of cultivators, their own strength was their own strength. It was unshakable and couldn't be suppressed. When the cultivator sensed that his strength was suppressed to less than a 10,000,000th of it, he felt an indescribable sense of weakness surging in his heart. Amidst this weakness, he admired Luo Fan even more for creating all of this. To be able to suppress my power so thoroughly, the sovereign is truly unbelievably powerful. The thought flashed through the cultivator's mind. With that thought, he directly threw himself towards the central continent. There were countless living beings on this central continent. There were also many extremely prosperous civilizations. The cultivator had clearly seen Luo Fan casting some light into the central continent. Although he did not know where it was exactly, he knew that if he wanted to find the way to the next continent, he had to start from the central continent. The power of the innate Grand Luo realm was naturally suppressed to the point that he felt that it was already his limit. However, in reality, he was still not a weak powerhouse on this continent. Although he wasn't the strongest, there weren't many who could defeat him. When the cultivator saw the living beings on this continent for the first time, he immediately understood. He could not kill too many of these living beings. Once he killed these living beings, the power that was suppressing him would keep increasing. In the end, he might even be suppressed to death. At that time, unless he could completely destroy the land of the 999-story tower, he would have no choice but to accept the suppression. While he was shocked, the living beings he saw were even more shocked. For a moment, many of the living beings knelt on the ground and greeted the great immortal. There were even some who asked the great immortal to take him as a disciple. All sorts of strange performances made the cultivator realize that even though he had been suppressed to this extent, he was still an extremely powerful powerhouse. The cultivator immediately began to ask about the situation on this continent, asking if anything special had happened recently. Through the narration of these living beings, he began to walk on this continent. In the end, he asked and searched again and again, going through many dangerous places, and finally found what he was looking for on this continent. It was the entrance to the next continent. It was here that he encountered the greatest test he had ever faced since he entered this continent. There were all sorts of terrifying forces guarding the entrance, waiting for him to explore it. These forces were so powerful that if he wanted to enter, he would be attacked by them. Only by blocking these attacks would he be able to truly step into the passageway and head to the second layer of the continent. Every single one of these powers was similar to the cultivator's own strength. Fighting against these forces was equivalent to fighting against a powerhouse on the same level as him. Under such circumstances, It wasn't too difficult for the cultivator to pass, but it definitely wasn't easy either. Come on then, let me see what level this test is. Seeing this, the cultivator let out a soft cry. He had been delayed on this continent for dozens of years. In the end, during these dozens of years, not only did he see the various forms of the mortal world on this continent, but he also encountered danger after danger. There were even a few times when he almost lost parts of his body. It was not easy for him to come here after spending so much effort. So how could he be stopped by the obstacles before him? With that cry, the cultivator charged straight toward the entrance of the passage. The passageway looked like a cliff in a strange mountain range. On both sides of this cliff, there were abstract carvings of huge, strange beasts. At this moment, after sensing the cultivator's figure charging toward the cliff, the carvings suddenly came to life. The originally abstract sculptures turned into detailed, strange beasts that suddenly erupted with earth-shattering power and fiercely slammed toward the cultivator. This attack did not shake this continent, and it did not even shake the space where this continent was located. However, the moment the cultivator sensed this attack, his body could not help but tremble. That's because he could clearly sense that this attack had already reached the limit of the power that he could bring out right now. Not a bit more, not a bit less. This not only required him to gather his strength to block this attack, but it also showed that the sculpture's control over his strength had reached an extremely profound level. This situation clearly indicated one fact. That was, all of his secrets were actually in the other party's eyes. In fact, this last point was the real reason why the cultivator was so shocked. It's just a little setup. How can it be so mysterious? The cultivator thought in shock. All kinds of thoughts flashed through his mind, but he did not stop moving. All kinds of power erupted, and in just a breath's time, he exchanged tens of millions of attacks with the many strange beasts. In the end, after spending 10 days and 10 nights, they finally charged into the cliff, or rather, into the passageway. The moment he passed through the passage, he felt waves of strange information enter his heart. This information involved some of the structure of the 999 continents, some of the purpose of this test, and some descriptions of the opportunities that could be obtained in the end. Of course, this was only a little bit. He could get a rough idea, but if he wanted to know the specific content, he could forget about even thinking about it. So that's how it is. No wonder the ruler didn't even give an explanation. So all of this information is contained within these layers of continents. At this moment, the cultivator came to a sudden realization, and he understood many things that he did not understand before. While he was thinking about this, his vision turned blank, and he arrived in a completely different world. When he arrived here, he felt that the power suppressing his body had strengthened again. Originally, he could still unleash the strength of an innate Grand Luo, but under the further strengthening of the suppressing power, the strength he could unleash had been reduced to the primordial pure yang realm. At this level, he had lost the ability to be self-sufficient. He was restricted by the world around him, but he was many times stronger than an innate Grand Luo. Compared to when he was reduced to an innate Grand Luo, this was an even greater blow to the cultivator. Even my essence is suppressed. The cultivator could not help but be shocked when he realized that he could not create the power he needed for cultivation from within his body, and could only absorb endless vitality from the outside world to replenish his consumption. One must know that it had been hundreds of millions of years since he last absorbed energy from the outside world to cultivate. Now that he was reliving it again, he could not get used to it for a while. He even needed to think about the cultivation method he used before he could come up with it, and he began to absorb the vitality from the outside world. This was something that the cultivator found hard to understand. One must know that the essence was something that the cultivator cultivated on his own, and it was a change that came from a deep level. It was a change in the foundation of life itself. He could understand that power and strength could be suppressed. After all, as long as he thought of this possibility, he only needed to think for a while to create such a suppression method. However, it was difficult to understand that even this essence could be suppressed, causing powerhouses who could produce their own power and did not need to rely on external energy to cultivate to lose the ability to produce power on their own. There's a great secret behind this suppression. The cultivator instantly made a judgment in his heart. Although a primordial pure yang realm powerhouse was still considered a powerhouse on the second continent, it no longer had as great of an advantage as it did on the first continent. It could even be said that a powerhouse of this level was only qualified to roam freely in this continent. Based on the analysis of the situation on the first continent, the various tests that Luo Fan had put into each continent were not unchanging, nor were they fixed. Instead, it was circulating endlessly on the entire continent according to some extremely strange laws. Therefore, looking for the passage to the next continent based on his memory of the place where the spiritual light entered was just an act of trying to fish from a tree. Even a slightly smarter ordinary person would not make such a mistake, let alone a powerful being like this cultivator who had reached the fifth tribulation. Even though his strength had been suppressed and his essence had been suppressed, this kind of knowledge and experience still existed. Chapter 2475. As the cultivator continued to search through the continents and take risks, this continent with 999 levels of the tower was gradually discovered by the other cultivators cultivating in the forbidden area. After all, these 999 continents were stacked on top of one another, and they seemed to be fixed in a strange position, so there were far too many signs of human activity. Even cultivators who didn't plan to come here couldn't help but want to explore this place after seeing the strange structure of this continent from afar. In this way, the existence of the 999-story High Pagoda continent would slowly be made public. Although this land of opportunity had only been formed for a short period of time, there were already several dozen cultivators who had landed on the first level of the land of opportunity apart from that cultivator. The moment they arrived at the first layer of the continent, the sudden pressure made them instantly understand the uniqueness of this continent. After discovering this uniqueness, some cultivators became excited and began to explore the first continent to find the source of this suppression. They wanted to find the reason for the existence of this continent. Some cultivators felt inexplicably terrified and wanted to escape this continent through the path they came from to escape this suppression. Luo Fan had considered this when he set up this land of opportunity. He didn't stop these cultivators who wanted to escape. These cultivators only needed to turn around, and they could immediately rush out of this continent and escape this land of opportunity. In fact, every level of the 999 continents had this setup. However, this did not mean that Luo Fan was really so kind and allowed these cultivators to come and go as they pleased. In fact, they could leave if they wanted to. However, once they left, they would never be able to set foot on the 999 levels again. In other words, from the moment the cultivators who chose to escape this land of opportunity left, they would no longer have any fate with this land of opportunity. This setup made the cultivators who escaped feel inexplicably regretful. These cultivators who could survive in this forbidden area were naturally not stupid people. There was no need to say much about their ability to see the big picture. When they were about to leave the continent, they understood that the continent below them would not be too dangerous. In fact, there might even be some rare, fortuitous encounters. After discovering this, most of them immediately wanted to return to the continent to search for that kind of opportunity. After all, they could leave this continent at any time. As long as they encountered real danger, they could leave in an instant. What kind of threat could such a place pose to them? However, when they planned to return to the continent, they found that there was an invisible and unimaginably sturdy layer of existence blocking their way. The way they rushed towards the continent made them feel dizzy, as if a fly had smashed into a window. What's going on? At this moment, the cultivators were all at a loss. They did not know why this kind of barrier had suddenly appeared. However, they were all knowledgeable cultivators. After some probing, they understood that this barrier was completely targeted at them. It was a kind of barrier that prevented them from stepping into the continent below. After understanding this, these cultivators instinctively realized that they might have missed a wonderful opportunity. This was not difficult to speculate. If it was a dangerous place, it was unlikely that it would limit the number of times people could enter. The kind of dangerous place would want everyone to enter. let alone retreat once. Even if they retreated hundreds of millions of times, it was likely that it would do its best to pull them in. On the contrary, only places of great fortune that were extremely beneficial to a cultivator but were rather limited could possibly restrict a cultivator from entering. They would only give cultivators one chance. Thinking of this, the cultivators could not help but feel inexplicably regretful. If I had known this would happen, I would have studied it thoroughly before leaving. They all sighed, feeling inexplicably disappointed. Of course, they didn't know what kind of opportunities were down there, after all. Even if they were disappointed, it was just a little. After trying for a few years to no avail, they directly left the continent of the 999-story tower. After all, this forbidden area was so vast. Although there were no definite places with opportunities, there were quite a lot of strange places that were beneficial to various cultivators. They did not have to cling to this land of opportunities and not let go of course. When they found out what kind of opportunities there were in this land of opportunities in the future, perhaps they would regret it even more. Because many cultivators gathered here to try to enter the continent, this location was naturally even more conspicuous in this forbidden area. As a result, more and more cultivators had unknowingly gathered at this tower from all over the place. And as more and more cultivators gathered, all kinds of exchanges naturally gradually appeared. The various characteristics of this tower were gradually known by the latecomers. Even if there were cultivators who wanted to see the latecomers make the same mistakes that they had made, it was impossible for all the cultivators to make the same mistakes that they had made. As long as not all of them thought the same way, the possibility of the latecomers making the same mistakes was naturally very small. After all, who could take risks in this forbidden area was not inexplicably cautious. How could they easily believe the words of others? Naturally, they would inquire more and use various ways to understand the situation below. However, after all, the information obtained by these latecomers was only their own guesses. After all, there would be latecomers who, after knowing all kinds of guesses, would still have doubts when they encountered the suppression. Therefore, they would leave the continent as soon as they were suppressed. In this way, the number of cultivators gathered on this tower did not decrease over time. On the contrary, it increased. In the end, when the first cultivator to enter the continent of the tower had reached about the 100th floor, the number of cultivators gathered around this tower had reached more than 10,000. At this time, only 1,000,000 years had passed. In such a short period of time, without any publicity, there were already tens of thousands of cultivators who had failed to enter the tower. From this, it could be seen how strong the desire of the cultivators on the 5th floor of the Dow Masters Road was for this opportunity. After all, there were tens of thousands of cultivators who had failed, and the number of cultivators who had successfully entered the continent of the tower was probably more than 10 times that number. At this time, the rumor that there was a strange land of opportunity in this forbidden area had already spread throughout the entire 5th floor of the Dow Masters Road. At this moment, outside the forbidden area, there were even more cultivators gathering from all over the place, guarding outside the forbidden area. These were cultivators who were not qualified to enter the forbidden area. Their numbers were over 100 times more than the number of cultivators guarding the continent of the tall tower. There was even a city vaguely appearing outside the forbidden area. These cultivators who were not qualified to enter the forbidden area were either not allowed by Luo Fan to enter the forbidden area, or their strength did not meet the requirements to enter the forbidden area. In other words, the cultivators whose light of heaven and earth had not completely condensed into an embryonic form. These cultivators cultivated in this city that had been formed for hundreds of thousands of years. They worked hard to improve their realms, and they worked even harder to find a way to enter the forbidden area despite their insufficient realms. This method of finding a way to enter the forbidden area without sufficient realms seemed incredible, but in fact, it was not strange at all. After all, the situation in the forbidden area was quite complicated. The forbidden area occupied by Luo Fan seemed mysterious, but it was only one of the countless forbidden areas on the 5th floor of the Dow Masters Road. Before the land of opportunity that Luo Fan had set up was discovered, such a forbidden area was just an ordinary, ordinary, forbidden area. Not many cultivators would conduct in-depth research on it. That was to say, before this, they were sure that the cultivators who had not condensed the embryonic form of heaven and earth could not enter the forbidden area. In fact, it was just an accumulation of experience. When the pioneers discovered this, the latecomers generally followed the pioneers' advice and did not enter without condensing the embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth. However, they did not study carefully to see if there would be any accidents. For example, would the forbidden land change with time, and would it be open to them at a certain time? Or would there be a weak spot at a specific location? In any case, there were many forbidden lands in the 5th level, and one forbidden land was not a big deal. Since they were not allowed to enter this place, they could just choose another forbidden land. However, the situation now was obviously different from before. Now, there was a continent of a tower with 999 floors in this forbidden area. Such an orderly and obvious arrangement of the land of fortune was clearly extremely attractive to all cultivators. This caused even more cultivators to want to enter the forbidden area. Under such circumstances, how could they not study the forbidden area? Over the past 1 million years, this kind of research had made great progress. Many cultivators had gradually discovered the rules of the operation of some of the forbidden lands. Not long ago, it was even said that there was an entrance in a certain location that had a slightly lower cultivation realm requirement. It was said that some cultivators who had not condensed the embryonic form of heaven and earth had already entered and returned safely. However, even so, most of the cultivators were still waiting patiently. They were waiting for those paths to be explored, and more importantly, they were waiting for news from the forbidden area. News about the land of opportunity. After all, although the land of opportunity seemed extremely mysterious and orderly, no cultivator had obtained that kind of fortuitous encounter. Whether the fortuitous encounter was worth the cultivators risking their lives to pursue was still not confirmed. Under such circumstances, how could these cultivators act so rashly? Although the entire city seemed lively, there was a kind of calmness that suppressed the city for the past 1 million years. Thus, the city did not fall into chaos because of the liveliness, and there was not much restlessness. On this day, a cultivator finally brought out a piece of news from the forbidden area. It was news from the continent with 999 levels of the tall tower. That fortuitous encounter can make the heaven and earth light evolve once, and it can even make one evolve once. Loud cheers burst out in the city. The entire city instantly became restless because of this eruption, and the calmness that suppressed the entire city seemed to have been broken in an instant. How could such a fortuitous encounter exist? Moreover, why hasn't anyone discovered it after so many years? At this moment, the cultivators were both in disbelief and excited. What did it mean to be able to make the heaven and earth light evolve once, and for oneself evolve once? It meant that if a cultivator condensed the embryonic form of heaven and earth light, they would immediately be able to complete the heaven and earth light. In the end, they would be able to ascend to a higher level, and they would be one step closer to becoming a true sage. How could the cultivators not flock to such a possibility? How could they not be excited? How could this news be fake? It was brought by my good friend who left the continent after he failed in his adventure. It's definitely true. Of course, if the land of the fortuitous encounter is a lie, then there's nothing we can do. The person who brought out the news was quite displeased with the doubts and immediately retorted. Hearing this, the cultivators became even more excited. In an instant, a large number of cultivators left the city and rushed toward the forbidden area. In the blink of an eye, dozens of cultivators rushed into the forbidden area, heading toward the depths of the forbidden area and the route that had been explored by the predecessors. During this process, most of the cultivators had successfully entered, but there was also a small portion of cultivators who had overestimated their strength or underestimated the dangers of the forbidden area, causing their bodies to collapse. They had to pay a great price to escape. There were even some unlucky ones who lost their lives in it. Even so, it was not enough to extinguish the restlessness in the hearts of the cultivators. More and more cultivators rushed into the forbidden area. Many entrances that had been explored before, and the rules that were not known to be real or fake, were tested by the cultivators at the fastest speed possible. Many cultivators who were not strong enough entered because of this, and many cultivators died in the process of testing. The previous news seemed to be a switch, and a steady stream of news came out of the forbidden area. Chapter 2476. Previously, the cultivators did not go all out in their exploration of the forbidden area because they were not clear about the specific situation of the land of fortuitous opportunities. Now, as more and more information about the land of fortuitous opportunities spread from the forbidden area, the cultivators' desire for the land of fortuitous opportunities finally broke through their rationality. The cultivators' desire for the land of opportunity finally broke through their rationality, or rather, broke through their cautious hearts. Because of this, their exploration of the forbidden area suddenly began to speed up. Originally, he would have to think about it before paying the price, but now, he paid it without even thinking about it. The price that they originally could not pay was now something that they could pay just by thinking about it. Under such circumstances, the extent of their exploration of the forbidden area began to increase. In just a few hundred years, they completed the exploration process that would have taken tens of thousands of years, or even tens of thousands of years to complete. However, at the same time, they also paid a price that would have taken tens of millions of years, or even tens of millions of years to complete. The number of cultivators who died due to this kind of exploration had unknowingly reached the tens of thousands. However, the results of this kind of exploration were also quite impressive. Through the efforts of many cultivators, after several hundred years, the various operating rules and specific details of the forbidden area were gradually discovered. Moreover, some cultivators had even discovered numerous paths, or rather, passageways, that allowed cultivators who weren't strong enough to form the embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth to enter the depths of the forbidden area. Due to the discovery of these routes, more and more cultivators who were not strong enough to form the embryonic form of heaven and earth light began to enter the forbidden area. The ruler of the forbidden area seemed to know what everyone was thinking. Over the past several hundred years, he had greatly relaxed the number of people who applied to enter the forbidden area. Unless they were too weak, or their attitude toward the ruler was too vile, or they were too contrary to the ruler's sense of beauty, the ruler did not reject any of these applications. This was also one of the reasons why this place was still peaceful. After all, after the mystical land of fortuitous opportunities appeared in this forbidden area, its value had increased by thousands of times compared to before. Originally, the other powerhouses on the 5th level could only watch as Luo Fan occupied the forbidden area and became its master because they did not have a strong desire for it. They did not think that this forbidden area was indispensable to them, so they did not want to offend Luo Fan because of this forbidden area. But now, with the birth of this land of opportunity, the attraction of this forbidden area had become many times stronger than before. With such a strong attraction, they gradually became less concerned about Luo Fan's deterrence. In other words, the price they were willing to pay in order to seize this forbidden area had become more and more than before. Under such circumstances, if Luo Fan obstructed their path and caused them to be unable to enter the place of fortune, then they would definitely start a war and directly challenge Luo Fan in order to obtain the opportunity to enter the place of fortune. However, it was obvious that Luo Fan did not do that all these years. He agreed to most of the cultivators who applied to enter the forbidden area. This caused those powerful cultivators to not have many excuses to challenge Luo Fan. At the very least, there were not enough benefits for them to challenge him. It was precisely because of this that this forbidden area had become so peaceful during these days, and there were no wars. At the very least, there were no wars on the level of the ruler of the forbidden area. Because of the efforts of many cultivators, and because of the price paid by many cultivators, the number of cultivators who entered the 999-story tower had increased by more than 10 times compared to before. The number of cultivators around the 999-story tower had unknowingly increased by more than 10 times compared to before. Due to the increase in the number of cultivators, one city after another had unknowingly appeared there. There were cultivators living in the cities, and they gradually formed settlements. The rules of the cities were also established, and a stable structure similar to that of a society was formed. Compared to the past, the cultivators who gathered around the continent were no longer failures. Instead, most of them were cultivators who were not confident enough to pass the various tests and were waiting for an opportunity to enter the 999-story continent. These cultivators kept going back and forth between these cities, looking for every cultivator who failed to escape from the continent of the tall tower, and exchanging all kinds of information about the continent of the tall tower with all kinds of prices, including information about the opportunities. Their behavior had unknowingly given birth to an industry of buying and selling information. In this industry, the purpose of entering the continent of the tall tower had unknowingly become no longer simple. At the very least, not every cultivator would challenge the 999 floors of the pagoda for the sake of that opportunity. At the very least, it was not all for the opportunity. There were many cultivators who simply wanted to gather more information about the continent of the 999-story pagoda so that they could explore it. Due to the change in goals and the fact that their original goals were no longer as simple as before, many cultivators who had entered the continent of the tall tower were no longer aiming for their goals as before. Instead, they were wholeheartedly heading towards the lower levels. Instead, many cultivators directly settled down on a certain level and constantly searched for all kinds of information on that level. Some even controlled the civilization of a certain level, as well as the dynasties or countries, and made those dynasties or countries their power to help them collect information about that continent and search for all kinds of information about the land of opportunities that might exist on that level. Among them, there were even some cultivators who directly controlled the passageway to the next level, forcing other cultivators to pay a sufficient price to enter the next level. Or, as long as they paid a sufficient price, they could directly save them a lot of time and bring them to the passage to the next level. Although the passage might change from time to time, or even undergo some unimaginable changes according to some unimaginable rules and become completely different from the previous time, as long as it existed, there would be traces of it. However, as long as it existed, there would be traces. If those cultivators were really willing to spend enough time and energy on controlling the passageway, they would definitely be able to discover it again after it changed, and they would definitely be able to discover the way to enter it after it changed its rules. As such, as time passed, the continent of the 999-story pagoda was gradually filled with more and more foreign cultivators. Not only did the influx of foreign cultivators pose a threat to the native living beings on the continent, but they also brought many fortuitous encounters to the continent. After all, although these foreign cultivators were suppressed by the continent of the 999-story tower and could only exert strength that was close to the highest level on each level, their knowledge, experience, and wisdom were not comparable to the cultivators of the same level on this continent. However, their knowledge, experience, and wisdom were not something that the cultivators of the same level on this continent could compare to. They only needed to reveal a few words, and it would be enough for the cultivation civilization on this continent to make great progress and greatly improve the level of the cultivation civilization on this continent. As for whether those cultivators were willing to reveal the cultivation information they possessed, it was needless to say. Whether they were willing or not, as long as they lived on this continent, as long as they communicated with other living beings on this continent, as long as they exerted their power on this continent, and even as long as they existed on this continent, the cultivation world on this continent would continue to absorb all the cultivation knowledge, concepts, and even the essence of power that they possessed that surpassed this continent. The only difference was that if there were cultivators who were willing to publicize and preach the Tao on this continent, the cultivation civilization on this continent would be able to absorb this knowledge much faster. If those stingy cultivators existed on this continent, the speed at which the cultivation civilization absorbed this knowledge would be slower. It was obvious that as long as there were enough cultivators who entered, there would definitely be those who were bold enough to publicize their cultivation knowledge and were willing to support the cultivation civilization on this continent. As a result, as more and more cultivators entered the continents, the cultivation civilizations on those continents naturally became more and more advanced. With this increase, the level of the strongest people on these continents would naturally increase as well. For these foreign cultivators, millions of years or even hundreds of millions of years were nothing. They did not even think that they could do anything with this bit of time. Those foreign cultivators might even waste such a long time just because of a possible opportunity. However, for the cultivation civilization on this continent, even if it was only 1,000,000 years, it was already an extremely long period of time. This period of time was enough for all the living beings on this continent to change hundreds or even thousands of times. The nutrients that the cultivation civilization absorbed during this process were not only enough to take root and sprout on this continent, but it was also enough to change the nature of the cultivation world on this continent. It was enough to make the powerhouses on this continent completely different from before, causing the powerhouses on this continent to have an earth-shattering increase. However, the increase in the cultivation level on this continent had unknowingly changed the continent. Not only did it change the various powers on the continent, but it also included the places of opportunities on the continent, the trials and the passages leading to the next continent, and even the suppression that the cultivators encountered after entering the continent. Generally speaking, the stronger the cultivation civilization, the less suppression the cultivators who entered the continent would experience. Although it was only 1,000,000 years, the improvement of the cultivation civilization was not too great, and the reduction in the suppression that the foreign cultivators experienced was relatively small. However, for many cultivators, as long as the suppression could be reduced, it would be a good thing for them, no matter how small the reduction was. Therefore, after the information was gathered, the cultivators who entered later became more and more relaxed about their own cultivation knowledge. Although they rarely preached publicly and openly imparted their knowledge to the other continents, they were more proactive in answering the questions of the living beings who had the opportunity to encounter them. Just like that, after 5,000,000 years, the suppression on the first continent had unknowingly weakened to a level where the cultivators could maintain the strength of a quasi-saint. The sudden change made many cultivators who were waiting outside overjoyed. When the suppression was reduced to the level of a quasi-saint, tens of thousands of cultivators directly descended on the continent with 999 floors of the pagoda, directly adding tens of thousands of quasi-saints to the first continent. Why is there such a drastic change? Do they break through some shackles? Some cultivators were puzzled by the sudden change, so they contacted the cultivators who were waiting on the continent and asked. The first continent was the beginning of the 999 floors of the pagoda, so the test here was the easiest. However, this did not mean that there were no cultivators waiting here. It did not mean that the cultivators were willing to give up the benefits of the first continent. After all, no matter what continent it would take a period of time to travel normally. Even on the first continent, if the cultivators traveled normally, it would take them at least a few decades to find the passage and pass the test to go to the second continent. In this way, guarding here would save the cultivators a few decades of time and allow them to go to the next continent. Most of the cultivators were willing to pay a certain price for this. When the cultivator who was waiting heard this, his expression changed slightly. He instantly asked for 3 times the normal price to give an answer. The answer shocked the latecomers. In fact, he didn't even ask any questions as he paid enough for the cultivator to bring him to the passageway leading to the next level to take the test. The reason for this change was very simple. It was because the reason given by the cultivator was strong enough to make the latecomers very vigilant. The reason was that a native cultivator of this level had finally found the passageway, passed the test of the passageway, and entered the second level of a 999-story high tower. It was because that cultivator entered the second floor that the suppression on the first floor of the pagoda was weakened, allowing the latecomers to have the strength of a quasi-saint. Chapter 2478. When the cultivators heard Taoist Zhongda's words, they became much calmer. Of course, they wouldn't be completely subverted by Taoist Zhongda's words. From an objective point of view, they viewed the conflict between the natives and the foreign cultivators. However, Taoist Zhongda's words gave them a great deterrent, preventing their irritation from breaking through their reason and causing them to do all sorts of irrational things that could even bring them great danger. After all, Taoist Zhongda's identity was right there. Over the years, with so many cultivators entering the forbidden area, it was naturally impossible for all of them to abide by the rules. Naturally, there were bound to be some cultivators who violated the rules set by the master, who had originally occupied the forbidden area for various reasons. Thus, every cultivator had seen the might and methods of the master of the forbidden area more than once. That sort of supreme might, that sort of strength that took all cultivators to be ants, caused all of them to be shocked, and it caused them to be extremely fearful. And it was clear that this master was standing behind Taoist Zhongda. In this way, Taoist Zhongda's attitude could almost be seen as that master's attitude, since Taoist Zhongda wanted them to obediently follow the rules and explore the 999 floors of the pagoda continent. Then unless they wanted the master to deal with them, they could only do as he said. Otherwise, they could only do as Taoist Zhongda said. Of course, there were all kinds of cultivators. Naturally, there were some cultivators who would wake up from their stupor because of Taoist Zhongda's words and stand on an objective point of view to observe the battle between the natives and the foreign cultivators. However, these were clearly in the minority and didn't need to be considered. What does Taoist Zhongda think we should do? A cultivator asked Taoist Zhongda. Taoist Zhongda shook his head and said, "Everyone misunderstands. I'm not asking you to follow my thoughts. I'm just saying that the karma for what you've encountered has been planted since the moment you began to slaughter the native cultivators. As for what you do, that's naturally your own business." His words were heard by the millions of cultivators present. For a moment, the expressions of the cultivators changed slightly. These changes were all different, but most of them were much more relaxed. After all, Taoist Master Zhongda's identity was rather special. If he really wanted to seek control, there was a great possibility of success. They didn't even have the ability to stop him, nor did they dare to stop him. Right now, Taoist Master Zhongda did not have this kind of intention. He was only reminding everyone, only letting everyone know the source of karma. He was still allowing the cultivators to act on their own, but this was eliminating the danger of being controlled and manipulated. How could they not breathe a sigh of relief? This way of doing things made the cultivators who had only heard of Taoist Master Zhongda's style, but hadn't seen it with their own eyes, truly understand why Taoist Master Zhongda didn't have any enemies after cultivating for so long. Each and every one of them could not help but develop a bit of respect for Taoist Master Zhongda. After all, this was something that they couldn't do, and it didn't conform to their cultivation path. Therefore, at this moment, the cultivators only bowed to Master Zhongda before leaving. They either entered the city or left this place of fortune. Those who entered the city were the cultivators who still wanted to seize the benefits from the place of fortune, while those who left were the hopeless losers. However, whether it was those who left or those who returned to the city, they were much calmer than before. The restlessness and anger of being offended by ants were almost non-existent at this time. Even the cultivators who didn't agree with Taoist Master Zhongda understood that the native cultivators weren't ants in their eyes, but powerhouses that could contend against them. Although it was uncomfortable to be defeated and expelled by such powerhouses, it wasn't a shameful thing. With this thought, they naturally wouldn't be angry out of humiliation. As for what happened outside the continent of the 999-story pagoda, the cultivators inside, whether they were foreign cultivators or native creatures, naturally wouldn't care. At this moment, the native creatures were cheering for their victory. They were celebrating that they had finally regained control of their own destiny and had finally taken back their homeland from the deterrence of the outsiders. As for the foreign cultivators, although they didn't huddle together, they were trying their best to hide themselves. They either used various forbidden areas or directly built various fortifications to resist the attacks of the alliance formed by the native creatures. As a result, the atmosphere of the entire continent of the 999-story pagoda inexplicably changed. It was already very different from before. After winning, the conflict within the alliance formed by the native cultivators gradually intensified. This was obviously inevitable. When facing the foreign cultivators, the continent of the 999-story pagoda was naturally won. All the native cultivators were each other's companions, and the greatest enemy between them was the foreign cultivators. However, this was the continent of the 999-story pagoda after all. Even though they didn't involve all the continents, there were still many continents that weren't touched by the cultivators at a very deep level, nor were they connected to other continents. However, it was still a continent with a large number of continents. With so many continents, it was naturally impossible for any two continents to be extremely close and friendly with each other. It was just like how it was impossible for all of the 999 people to be friends. Among them, some would definitely be friends, some would be opponents, and some would even be enemies or enemies. If they had a common enemy, for example, the 999 people would have to unite in order to survive and have a future. In that case, they would naturally have to unite and suppress their dislike, displeasure, and even hatred toward each other. However, once the common enemy disappeared and there was no longer a common opponent to suppress them, the conflicts, and hatred between them would naturally erupt. If these 999 people still had to choose some commanders and some controllers, then there would be all sorts of conflicts, which would only be greater. Now that the foreign cultivators had been defeated and they had regained control of the continent of the 999-story pagoda, the greatest enemy of the native cultivators had clearly disappeared. At this point, to them, the greatest enemy had already become each other. The various conflicts, hatred, and displeasure that were originally suppressed by the greater enemy naturally began to erupt. As such, the harmony and peace of the continent of the 999-story pagoda only lasted for a few hundred years. After a short few hundred years, chaos broke out once again. The native cultivators on the continent of the 999-story pagoda experienced all sorts of splits. An originally complete alliance had unknowingly broken down into dozens of forces, each occupying a certain number of continents. Of course, most of them had established their own bases on the continents, dividing the continents into territories that were completely different from the original ones. After all, compared to the ordinary division of territories, the continent of the 999-story pagoda still had its own unique characteristics. What was special about it was that below the 999-floored continent of the pagoda, at the deepest level, there was an extremely amazing opportunity for all cultivators. In this way, any level was naturally extremely important to any force. If a certain level didn't have a certain faction's base and strength, then that faction's future would be completely cut off. If they could not pass through a certain level, then how could that force continue to explore and pursue the ultimate opportunity? If they could not pursue that opportunity, then what was the reason for these forces to exist? How could the cultivators who joined these forces be willing to risk their lives for a force that had no future at all? It was precisely because of this that such a strange pattern was formed on the continent of the 999-story pagoda. The formation of this pattern also caused each level of the continent of the 999-story pagoda to gradually become homogeneous. This homogenization caused each level of the continent to feel extremely similar. Apart from the different rules, the different suppression on living creatures and cultivators, and the different terrains. Things that could be found on other continents could be found on almost any level of the continent. The support that could be obtained on other continents could also be obtained on almost any level of the continent. Of course, similarly, the enemies and dangers that they encountered on other continents could also be encountered on any level of the continent. This situation caused the continent of the 999-story pagoda to become faintly lifeless. Under such a background, the foreign cultivators gradually began to emerge again. After all, the foreign cultivators were absolute powerhouses. If any of them truly displayed their might, they would be terrifying existences that could easily destroy the entire continent of the 999-story pagoda. Even if such existences failed for a while, they could not fail forever. Without the unity and suppression of all the native cultivators on the continent of the 999-story pagoda, the foreign cultivators could naturally regroup and emerge again. They became another force on the 999-story pagoda, a force that was stronger than almost any other force. If the foreign cultivator's style was still the same as before, which was to kill all the native cultivators, then their emergence would most likely become an opportunity for the native cultivators to unite again. This would directly change the chaotic state of the continent of the 999-story pagoda. However, it was obvious that this would not happen. After facing the strength of the native cultivators, how could the foreign cultivators possibly make the same mistake as before? After they emerged again, they did not take the initiative to eliminate the native creatures like before to reduce the number of competitors for the ultimate opportunity. Instead, they behaved like a normal force that had grown up on the 999-story pagoda continent. They followed the rules that they had formed over the past hundreds of years and competed with other forces within the scope of these rules. In this way, the attitudes of the various forces towards them had diverged. Some forces naturally did not trust these foreign cultivators at all, and they insisted on gathering all their strength to defeat them again. However, most forces believed that as long as these foreign cultivators could abide by the rules, it did not matter whether they existed or not. After all, foreign cultivators could not be killed. Even if they were expelled, they would still exist. Once the situation changed in the future and those foreign cultivators were able to enter again, what awaited them would be a disaster of annihilation. Even if things did not change and those foreign cultivators could not come in, they would still have to leave, right? Could it be that so many cultivators would have to stay in this continent of the 999-story pagoda forever? Would they have to spend their remaining years in this region that was only the size of sesame seed or a mung bean in the eyes of those outsiders? If they offended those outsiders too much and they kept guarding outside, how could they ensure their own safety outside? There were obviously many more cultivators who had this thought than those who had the first one. In this way, the final result was obvious. Although the forces formed by the outsiders encountered many enemies in the process of rebuilding and were targeted by many, overall, they were still accepted. In the end, they joined the system formed by many forces and began to establish their own bases on the continents. Participating in the division of the continents, along with this change, the situation on the 999-story pagoda continent gradually stabilized. The goal of many cultivators gradually shifted to exploring the depths of the continent. They wanted to explore the place of opportunity that could bring them great benefits from the light of heaven and earth. Just like that, time passed by leisurely, and hundreds of thousands of years passed. On this day, the 999-story continent finally opened under the efforts of many cultivators. We've finally arrived at the last level. As long as we pass this level, we can obtain that opportunity. The cultivator who opened the 999-story continent was a native cultivator. Chapter 2479. When the native cultivator stepped into the 999th level of the tower, an endless amount of light suddenly appeared out of thin air and crushed down on him. At this moment, the native cultivator's expression changed greatly. His power surged, and all sorts of spells and powers surged out. He wanted to block the light and avoid being affected by the terrifying power contained within the light. However, it was a pity that the brilliance was so terrifying and absolute. Faced with his various obstructions and resistance, it was as if he was facing a piece of paper. Without any resistance, it crushed everything and ruthlessly and mercilessly crushed his body. With a soft sound, the native cultivator's body and mind instantly collapsed. Aside from a mark, everything else was completely erased. Only the mark was left. It fused with the light around it, and as it circulated slightly, It flowed out of the continent with 999 levels of the tower. Then, it once again entered the continent with 999 levels of the tower. However, the place he entered this time was no longer the 999th level that he had spent millions of years of effort to reach. Instead, he entered the first level of the 999th level of the tower. In other words, the first level that all the foreign cultivators appeared on after entering this continent. What's going on? Why is this happening? It took the native cultivator a while to recover his thoughts. However, his mind was filled with indescribable doubts, and he was completely dumbfounded. It has to be said that his experience was indescribably strange. This kind of experience was completely different from what he had imagined. No matter which level he had been to before, the moment he entered, his strength would at most be suppressed. Although there was danger, it was mostly because of the cultivators or the forces that had set up bases on that level. There wasn't much danger that came from the continent itself. This time, when he stepped on the 999th level, he encountered a danger that he had never encountered before. It was a danger that was triggered by the land itself, a danger that could wipe him out completely. However, it was precisely this kind of danger that left a mark on him in the end. In fact, this mark even passed through the boundless forbidden land outside the tower and entered the first level. It entered the reincarnation cycle of the first level, causing him to turn into a baby in the blink of an eye. These developments had obviously completely overturned his understanding, and it even caused him to start suspecting whether this place of fortune was an endless loop. Was it a formidable existence that was intentionally toying with all the cultivators that were working hard for this fortune? My foundation has been reconstructed. Suddenly, the cultivator trembled as he discovered the changes in his body. At this moment, not only had he reincarnated into a living being, but his most fundamental foundation had also been reconstructed because of this reincarnation. This reconstructed foundation was tens of thousands of times stronger than his original foundation. It felt as if he had completely transformed what he had cultivated for hundreds of millions of years into the foundation of this life. One must know that the cultivator who was able to stand out among the countless cultivators and be the first to pass through the barrier of the 999th level of the tower and step into the last level. Even if he was only a native cultivator of the 999th level of the tower, his strength and power were definitely not something that ordinary cultivators could compare to. Before he stepped onto the 999th floor of the tower, his strength had already reached the level of a supreme emperor. This level was already the highest level of strength that the 999th level of the tower could withstand. In other words, any cultivator, no matter if they were an outsider or a native, no matter how strong they were originally, no matter if they were a fifth tribulation expert or an even higher expert, as long as they didn't surpass Luo Fan, the strongest strength they could display would only stop at the Supreme Emperor realm. This level of strength was stronger than despair warriors, false saints, quasi-saints, and only Khanate Grand Luo realm. It could be said that such a span was already extremely impressive, and it was enough for many cultivators to struggle within this range. Before this cultivator stepped into the 999th level of the tower, he was at the highest level that could struggle within this range. Now, what he had cultivated in his previous life, the limitless power, and the limitless comprehension of cultivation, had all been compressed and transformed into the foundation of his current life. With such a change, the strength of his foundation in this life had already reached a shocking level. Even among the foreign cultivators, there were probably not many who could have such a terrifying foundation. With such a foundation, he did not even need to cultivate. He only needed to breathe, and his body had already begun to continuously absorb the boundless vitality from the outside world and convert it into his own strength. In just a few days, he had already broken through the limits of mortals and become an itinerant immortal. He was just an ordinary baby when he was born, but he had already become an itinerant immortal after a few days. This situation was quite unbelievable even in the cultivation world. Could it be that I have to recultivate? After obtaining the realm of an itinerant immortal, the cultivator finally relaxed a little and began to think about the reason for all of this. After all, He had suspected that the powerhouse who created this land of opportunity was just playing with the countless living beings like them. His speculation was just something he said out of anger, because he could not maintain his calm under the drastic changes. An existence with such an ability would definitely not be bored to this extent. In other words, the existence who created this land of opportunity must have a reason to do so. After thinking about it, with the various changes in the process of his reincarnation, this reason seemed to be to make him recultivate and reconstruct himself, whether it was his foundation or cultivation. Could it be that I'm missing something and am not qualified to continue at all? As he thought about all these, this thought appeared in his mind. It was only natural for him to deduce from the original reasons to this step. But what exactly am I missing? Isn't it too irresponsible to just throw me back to recultivate? After thinking for a long time, the cultivator could not help but cry out. It must be known that he had walked the path of cultivation in his previous life for hundreds of millions of years. After such a long time, everything that he cultivated in his previous life had already completely integrated into his life origin and become a part of him. Even if he only left a mark now, he still could not completely break away from the path of his previous life. Under such circumstances, even if he managed to reconstruct his foundation, he would unknowingly return to his original path if he did not receive any guidance. In other words, perhaps he would be stronger than he was in his previous life, but in the end, his essence would still not be much different from his previous life. Obviously, even if the cultivator did not know what the final test was, he knew that such an outcome was not what the existence who created this land of opportunity wanted to see. In other words, if he continued to cultivate like this, even if he eventually reached the 999th level of the continent, his fate would not be much different from now. He would probably be unable to withstand the attack of the continent as soon as he stepped into it, and would immediately collapse, be destroyed, and turn into a mark. As for whether he would have a chance to reincarnate after that, it would probably depend on the thoughts of the creator of this land of opportunity. Amidst this confusion, the native cultivator lived obediently for more than 20 years. During these 20 years, he had been living obediently in his home according to the way an ordinary living being lived. He was filial to his parents, took care of his elders, and lived according to the rules of the world. He even passed the imperial examination and was prepared to become an official in the imperial court. The reason why he made this choice was naturally not because he had given up on himself, but because he clearly knew that in such a situation where he knew nothing, the more mistakes he made, the more mistakes he would make. Only by doing things according to the rules and doing things according to his identity as much as possible was the right choice. After understanding this, it was natural for him to make such a choice. Of course, it was also fortunate that he had become an itinerant immortal a few days after he was born, which was why he could be so carefree. Becoming an itinerant immortal meant transcending the mortal world and transcending the limits of one's lifespan. From then on, as long as he didn't die from external forces, he would never die again. In this way, his life in the mortal world wouldn't affect him much. Even if it was delayed for tens of thousands of years, it wouldn't matter to him. This was the fundamental reason why he had chosen to become an itinerant immortal as soon as he was born. For a powerful being who had lived for who knew how many hundreds of millions of years, knowing that he would die in 100 years was an absolutely unbearable feeling. For an existence like him who had lived for hundreds of millions of years, what difference was there between 100 years and tomorrow? On this day, the creature was preparing to go to another town to become a county magistrate. Halfway through his journey, he raised his head and discovered that the sun in the sky was emitting a boundless brilliance, providing this entire world with endless light and heat. This scene, which was originally extremely ordinary, suddenly gave him an indescribable feeling. His strength, which had not moved for a long time, suddenly began to circulate involuntarily. His cultivation realm, which hadn't improved at all for more than 20 years, instantly began to rise rapidly. In the blink of an eye, he surpassed the itinerant immortal realm and became a true immortal. In the past, this kind of progress was something he wouldn't even be willing to pay attention to. However, from an itinerant immortal to a true immortal, this was actually a qualitative improvement. As for the improvement of his strength, it was calculated in the hundreds of thousands of times. In a situation where he hadn't cultivated at all, he had only been struck by the sight of the sun in the sky. This was clearly an unimaginable feat for a cultivator like him. At this moment, the cultivator was stunned on the spot. Countless lights flashed through his mind, but these lights were extremely slippery. Even though he knew that these lights existed, he still couldn't catch them. He couldn't determine what these lights were. For a moment, he felt inexplicably irritated. As a county magistrate, the cultivator naturally couldn't set off alone. There were a few servants serving him beside him. When the servants saw their young master suddenly standing there and releasing an indescribable holy aura, they couldn't help but kneel on the ground and call him an immortal. Their shouts woke the cultivator up from his trance. The countless spiritual lights disappeared in an instant as if they had never existed in the first place. This sudden change caused the cultivator's expression to change greatly. An unimaginable sense of irritation made him want to immediately wipe out these servants who had served him since he was a child. Fortunately, he was still rational and knew that this matter couldn't be blamed on them. In the end, he barely suppressed the anger in his heart and only calmed down after a while. "Get up. Let's continue on our way," he said to the servants. As for explaining his strength and what happened just now, he naturally couldn't do such a thing to the cultivator before him. Just as the cultivator was about to move forward towards his goal, a light suddenly appeared in the bottom of his heart. The light instantly grew and filled his entire mind. In the blink of an eye, he understood what the light was that he couldn't catch no matter how hard he tried. So that's how it is. Wrong. Everyone was wrong. This layer of the continent isn't used like this. He laughed heartily. There was an indescribable joy on his face, but there was also an indescribable sense of regret. He was naturally happy that he had finally figured out what he couldn't figure out before, but he was regretful that he had only figured it out now. If he had figured this out in his previous life, perhaps he would have truly stepped into the final land of opportunity. Why would he need to reincarnate as a mortal? "Young master?" At this moment, the servant called out worriedly. In the eyes of these servants, their young master was indeed extremely strange. No matter how they looked at it, it was as if some sort of uncontrollable change had occurred. Chapter 2480. With a single step, the cultivator had already disappeared before the eyes of the servants. The servants turned pale with fright. They searched everywhere and even reported to their clans, mobilized their clans' forces, and even requested help from the cultivation sects that their clans relied on. However, in the end, they could not find a cultivator. It was as if their young master had never existed. He had completely disappeared from their lives and the lives of the cultivator's parents in this life. This naturally caused endless sorrow and pain, as well as endless worry and fear. However, these had nothing to do with the cultivator anymore. On that day, after gaining an intangible enlightenment from the sun in the sky and suddenly realizing the truth of the 999 levels of the high tower, the cultivator was no longer in the mood to play house with the mortals. To him, the most important thing was clearly cultivation. He was cultivating according to the deep mysteries contained in the 999 levels of the high tower. After leaving that place, he appeared on a nearby mountain peak. After arriving here, he sat down with his legs crossed and began to breathe in the endless vitality of the outside world. He absorbed the traces of the mysteries of cultivation that he had not noticed before. As he did this, the power in his body surged, and all kinds of strange immortal sounds and Sanskrit chants emerged. His cultivation base began to rise slowly, breaking through one small realm after another. This process of breaking through lasted for 1,000 years. After 1,000 years, when he regained consciousness, his cultivation base had barely reached the peak of the primordial unity pure yang stage. To reach this stage, after 1,000 years of careful cultivation, was already an unbelievably fast growth speed for ordinary living beings. However, For this cultivator who had cultivated for hundreds of millions of years in his previous life and had overcome countless obstacles to finally reach the 999th level, it was so slow that it was almost unbearable. Normally, he should have been able to complete this kind of improvement in a few months. The reason why he would spend so much time was actually very simple. During these 1,000 years, this cultivator didn't spend most of his energy on improving his cultivation. Instead, he spent most of his energy on reconstructing his path of cultivation and reconstructing the essence of his life. Although the imprint reincarnation had given him an extremely strong foundation, allowing his cultivation base to far surpass other living beings, and he could improve his cultivation base at the fastest speed if he wanted to. However, that was after all only the foundation of his body and mind. As for the core cultivation path that was more closely related to cultivation, he was still not much different from his previous life. If he cultivated with this kind of cultivation path, even if he had an extremely strong foundation, his final achievement would only stop at his cultivation base in his previous life. At most, he would be a little stronger, and this was clearly far from enough to truly pass the 999 levels of the high tower and surpass the powerhouse who set up the land of opportunities to obtain the greatest opportunity in this land of opportunities. It was precisely because of this that in the 20 years after he was born, the cultivator only solved the problem of his lifespan and stopped cultivating. He even had the mood to play house with his mortal parents. However, on that day when he saw the sun, he instinctively comprehended something, and his cultivation base automatically improved. He unknowingly obtained a sublimation of his essence, which finally broke through the confusion in his heart. He suddenly understood countless things that he had overlooked in the past, and he understood the true purpose of the 999 levels of the high tower. After realizing this, he was full of admiration for the existence who set up the 999 levels of the high tower. He even felt an indescribable sense of gratitude from the bottom of his heart, making him want to immediately worship that powerhouse. As expected, the essence of the high tower's continent isn't a test at all, but guidance and reconstruction. When the cultivator came back to his senses and observed his greatly changed cultivation path, a look of realization appeared on his face, and this thought flashed through his mind. What he had comprehended back then was that the essence of the 999 levels of the high tower's continent lay in the countless extremely hidden cultivation mysteries that existed in each level of the high tower's continent. Without a certain cultivation base, one would not be able to discover them at all. These mysteries of cultivation were mysterious and wonderful. They contained profound principles that the cultivator couldn't even imagine. If he cultivated according to the mysteries of cultivation, he would be able to walk on a path of cultivation that was countless times brighter than his previous path. At this moment, although the cultivator was only at the peak of the primordial unity pure sun realm, he felt that his strength was already comparable to the peak of the innate grand Luo realm in his previous life. In fact, the gap was quite huge. If he were to fight with the peak of the innate grand Luo realm in the past, he would not even be able to withstand a light pat from his current self. Moreover, apart from the improvement of his strength, his understanding of cultivation had also undergone a fundamental change. Vaguely, he realized many things that he did not know in the past, and learned of all the things that he did not think were missing in the past. Now, with just a slight thought, he could already think of countless inspirations that he could not think of before, and knew countless directions to move forward that he did not know in the past. As he stood up and gazed into the distance, the scene of the entire continent was completely imprinted in his mind. Although the peak of the primordial unity pure sun realm was not too strong, and could only be considered as a middle-level cultivator on this continent, nevertheless, he was still a primordial unity pure sun realm expert. From an absolute point of view, this level could already be considered as the level of an expert. For such an existence, a distance of billions of kilometers was clearly nothing to it. With just a slight thought, he would be able to sense everything within a radius of hundreds of millions of kilometers. Of course, being able to do this and being able to do it secretly were two concepts after all. At this moment, his perception swept out, but it was unknown how many experts had also sensed his perception. Perception after perception spread out from all directions towards where he was, also sweeping through where he was. When they saw that it was a primordial unity, pure sun realm cultivator who was spying on them, most of the cultivators were displeased. Immediately, the sky above this area surged, and countless dark clouds gathered. Lightning fell from the sky, scraping the ground within hundreds of miles. However, this cultivator was not an ordinary cultivator after all. Even such a shocking conflict was nothing to him. He was not hurt at all because of this. Although he was not hurt at all, he did not continue to use his perception to spy on them. Instead, he retracted his perception. After all, his strength was not considered strong at this time, and he did not have much confidence in facing so many experts. Besides, his perception just now had already achieved his goal, so he did not need to take the risk of provoking others to provoke them. At this moment, his expression did not change, but this thought flashed through his mind, and he was referring to none other than the indigenous cultivators in this continent with 999 levels of the tall pagoda. He was referring to were none other than the native cultivators on the continent with 999 floors. As for the foreign cultivators, this cultivator was completely speechless. In his previous life, as a native cultivator, he couldn't stand the sight of outsiders. After all, to the outsiders, the native cultivators were competing with them for the opportunities prepared for them, and they deserved to die. However, to these native cultivators, was the situation not the same? To them, the foreign cultivators were also competing for the opportunities of the native cultivators. In this case, how could these living beings have a good impression of the outsiders? To them, it was a good thing that these outsiders were all dead. It was precisely because of this mentality that there would be open and veiled conflicts between the native cultivators and the outsiders, and that many cultivators would be divided into factions that rejected each other. At this moment, this cultivator was not the vanguard of the battle between the two factions, but he was still considered the main force. There were countless foreign cultivators who were defeated and eliminated by him. Therefore, in his previous life, he actually did not think much of the foreign cultivators. In his heart, he even thought that the ones who would obtain the ultimate opportunities would definitely not be the foreign cultivators, but the native cultivators who were born and raised in this continent with 999 levels of the tall pagoda. However, at this time, after observing the first level of the tall pagoda from a different perspective, he realized that his previous understanding was really wrong. The gap between them, the native cultivators and the foreign cultivators, was countless times greater than he had imagined. It could be said that for the foreign cultivators, the fundamental reason why they performed so poorly was not because they were weak, but because of the suppression of this continent with 999 levels of the tall pagoda. In fact, to be honest, any foreign cultivator was far better than any cultivator on this continent with 999 levels of the tall pagoda. Whether it was him in his previous life or the current emperor who stood at the peak among the native cultivators on this continent with 999 levels of the tall pagoda, they were all the same. If the situation did not change, and the entire continent with 999 levels of the tall pagoda remained the same, the ones who would obtain the ultimate opportunities would definitely not be the native cultivators, but the outsiders. There was no other reason for this. Strength was secondary. More importantly, each of the outsiders met the requirements to pass the 999th level of the tall pagoda. There is no need to recultivate, no need to reconstruct their foundations, and no need to reconstruct their paths of cultivation. With their current situation, they had already fulfilled the conditions that the strongest native cultivator, who had to sacrifice all of his cultivation achievements in exchange for. The more he saw this situation, the more shocked he felt, and the more frustrated he felt. The gap is actually so huge. The cultivator smiled bitterly, and there was already a faint sense of despair in his heart. Can I really cross such a huge gap before someone obtains the opportunity? This thought emerged in his heart. However, the answer made him feel even more despair. Fortunately, this cultivator was an existence who climbed to the peak bit by bit from being weak. After all, his will was unimaginably firm. After feeling despair for a short while, he regrouped and suppressed all kinds of negative emotions, and his mind returned to its original state of clarity. No matter what, no matter how long it takes, no matter whether I can obtain the opportunity in the end, it won't go wrong to rebuild myself and improve myself. In the past, I didn't know how to do it, but now that I have this opportunity, how can I let it go? With that thought in mind, all kinds of distracting thoughts were eliminated. He lifted his foot and took a step forward, and his figure disappeared without a trace. After recognizing how huge the gap between the native cultivators and the outsider cultivators was, the cultivator no longer kept it to himself. Instead, he began to spread the true essence of the 999 levels of the tall pagoda that he had comprehended over the past year, letting more and more cultivators know of his comprehension. Some cultivators believed in this kind of enlightenment, but most cultivators were dismissive. There were some things that some people would never believe unless they truly experienced it. Among them, the more determined one was, the more they would not believe it. Evidently, those who could stand out among the many native creatures and be valued by this cultivator were definitely not people with weak willpower. The cultivator had expected this situation, but he was not disappointed. After all, he was not doing this out of selfishness, but out of a sense of justice. If those cultivators believed it, it was naturally their own luck. If they succeeded in the future, it would be their own gains. For this cultivator, he did not gain any benefits from this. If those cultivators did not believe it, it would be their own loss, and the cultivator would not lose any benefits. In this way, he naturally wouldn't feel any negative emotions because of their distrust. In the following days, he walked all over this continent and continuously comprehended the endless mysteries of cultivation. Through them, he continuously reshaped his path of cultivation and solidified his somewhat shallow foundation. At the same time, he continued to impart his comprehension to one cultivator after another, gradually leaving behind more and more legends on this continent. Chapter 2481. What wishful thinking! What's wrong with our foundation? This person must have been assimilated by this world and unknowingly placed the creator of this world in a supreme position. That's why he made such a conjecture. Some cultivators were disdainful of such a view. They felt that it was a boundless uplift to the existence that had created this continent with 999 floors. It was their rationality, and their minds had already been assimilated by this land of fortune. They had unknowingly become the prayers of this land of fortune. Despite this, not only did these cultivators not try their best to comprehend the mysteries and truths contained in these continents that they had overlooked in the past, they became even more wary of them. In the extreme, some of them even paid a huge price to cleanse their bodies and remove the mysteries and truths that they had comprehended from this continent bit by bit. Of course, there were those who didn't believe in this, and there were also those who believed in this. These cultivators who believed in this view began to shift their attention from the entrances and trials that existed on the continents to the continents themselves. They began to spend more time and energy on the mysteries of the continents. As a result, their speed of advancement naturally slowed down. Due to these different attitudes, many cultivators began to split into two sides. The cultivators who believed in this view began to stay on each continent for longer periods of time, and the speed at which they advanced to the deeper continents began to slow down. As for the cultivators who didn't believe in this view, in order to avoid being eroded by the world, they began to accelerate, wishing that they could only stay on each continent for a split second so that they could break through the obstacles of this level and advance to the next continent. As a result, in the following short 100,000 years, the number of cultivators who entered the 999th level that would normally only appear once every millions of years increased by countless times. There were thousands of cultivators who entered the 999th level. Of course, the final result was the same as the first native cultivator who entered the 999th level. He was crushed by the unimaginable light that existed on the 999th level, and only a trace of his mark was left. Following the laws of the 999th level, he returned to the highest level of the continent like the first native cultivator. When they were reborn on the first level of the continent, these cultivators were all dumbfounded, unable to understand what they had encountered. How is this possible? Why are we reborn? Why is the requirement for the 999th level so high? These cultivators were on the verge of breaking down. This strange experience made them suddenly wonder if they were wrong. Was it really like the legend, where they had to follow the guidance of each continent to reconstruct their own cultivation path in order to have a chance to break through the shackles of the 999th level and step into the final land of opportunity? However, even though they had already reincarnated, they could not immediately announce this situation to the public. Thus, for the other cultivators, they still maintained their original mindset and continued to act according to their original methods. They were either extremely fast or extremely slow. As a result, one cultivator after another followed in their footsteps. All of them entered the 999th level before they made any preparations and were reborn on the first level. Several decades later, when some cultivators finally saw the mysteries of the first layer again and reconstructed their foundations, they finally realized that they had taken the wrong path when they truly witnessed the mysteries of the legends that guided them to reconstruct their foundations. For a moment, they were filled with regret. One by one, they came to see the first cultivator who spread the news and expressed their apologies to him. They also asked him for advice on how to strengthen their foundations and change their cultivation path. Even though 100,000 years had passed, the cultivator was still on the first level. However, compared to the past, he was no longer in existence that could only mingle around the bottom of the first level. Unbeknownst to him, he had grown into the most supreme existence on the first level of the continent. He had become a supreme ruler of the first level. The reason for this was none other than the fact that his cultivation had already stepped into the pseudo-saint realm. To the countless outsiders, this cultivation base was naturally insignificant. However, under the circumstance that all the outsiders and native living beings on the first level were suppressed to the quasi-saint realm, the strength of a pseudo-saint realm powerhouse was enough to crush and annihilate everything. With such strength, he naturally became the most powerful being on the first layer of the continent. With strength came status. Naturally, his status had unknowingly become the highest in the first layer of the continent. With his strength, he could have entered the second level a long time ago and continued his journey to the deepest level. However, he could not help it. He could still sense how profound the mysteries on the first level were. He felt that he was still so insignificant before the first level. In that case, he had long lost the chance to obtain the final opportunity. Instead, he treated the 999th level of the high tower as his path of cultivation and a path to rebuild his foundation. Naturally, he could not directly enter the second level. His choice allowed him to understand the first level of the continent far better than any other cultivator, including those who had reincarnated because of the terrifying light from the 999th layer, the creatures who had reincarnated because of the marks left by the 999th layer. After the cultivator realized that he no longer had much chance to obtain the final opportunity, his mentality had changed completely. For the current him, the things that he had comprehended were no longer exclusive to him. Therefore, he did not refuse any of the cultivators who asked him for guidance. He told them everything he knew without holding anything back. In fact, he would often hold forums and give lectures, directly explaining his understanding of the mysteries of the first continent to the living beings on the first continent, explaining the subtle principles contained in the first continent that ordinary cultivators could not sense. His actions made his reputation on the first layer of the continent rise higher and higher. Unknowingly, he had already been addressed as a Tao ancestor. In the eyes of the foreign cultivators, this title was naturally a joke. However, to the native living beings, it represented the highest prestige. Even the beings of other levels who did not trust this cultivator had to respect him. Regardless of whether he had become the petitioner of the 999 continents or not, his open-minded attitude and shocking boldness were enough to make anyone admire him. With such prestige, The views that the cultivator originally publicized were naturally accepted by more and more neutral people. In fact, some powerful cultivators who already had the qualifications to head to the deeper levels directly rushed back from the deeper levels after hearing that the cultivator was going to give a lecture, just to listen to the various principles that he had comprehended. In the end, after a few decades, there were even cultivators who had reincarnated, directly worshipped this cultivator, and became his disciples. They wholeheartedly waited by this cultivator's side just to obtain more guidance and more mysteries from this cultivator. After all, these cultivators who had reincarnated were all extremely arrogant in the past, and their strength was unimaginably powerful. If they were in the past, they would not think that they were inferior to anyone no matter who they faced. Even if the powerful existence that had created the 999th level of the tall tower was standing before them, they might have to weigh the other party's strength before acknowledging him. Yet now, even though they were so arrogant, they obediently knelt before that cultivator and worshipped him as their disciple. This was enough to show how great the gains that cultivator had made over the years, and to what extent the gap between him and the native cultivators had widened. On this day, a disciple asked after listening to the cultivator's lecture, "Teacher, with your current strength, are you able to resist the outsiders?" The reason he asked this was clearly because the contents of the cultivator's lecture had greatly broadened his horizons. He felt that his teacher was unfathomable and seemed to be omnipotent, omniscient, and omniscient. Hearing this, the cultivator referred to as the Tao ancestor sighed and said, "It's easier said than done to compare to them." These words caused the cultivator who asked to be slightly taken aback. He said, "Teacher, why do you have to belittle yourself? I've seen those outsiders. Although they are powerful, they don't have the unfathomable feeling that teacher has. I think they are inferior to teacher." The Tao ancestor shook his head helplessly and said, "You only see what you can see, but you don't know that what you can't see is the main point. I only discovered the shocking secret hidden in their bodies after my strength increased to a certain level." Secret? At this time, the other disciples were already very interested. Prying into a secret was an irresistible temptation for any living being. Even such a powerful cultivator was no exception. The premise was that the secret had to be at the same level as them or even higher. Obviously, although they were not happy with those outsiders, these cultivators had to admit that the outsiders were extremely powerful. Even if they were not as powerful as their teacher, they were definitely not much weaker. In other words, they were existences that were far superior to them. How could they not be interested in the secret of such existences? The Tao ancestor asked the disciple who asked the question just now, "How much of their overall strength do you think the strength that those outsiders can display on each level accounts for?" The disciple was stunned for a moment, then said with some uncertainty, "If it's on this first level, it should be 1 in 10,000, right?" This guess of 1 in 10,000 was actually an exaggeration to him. After all, his teacher seemed to have said that he had underestimated the outsiders. Since that was the case, he increased his original estimate by 10 times. The Tao ancestor sighed and said, 1 in 10,000? As expected, you haven't truly realized how terrifying they are." These words caused the expressions of all the disciples present to change drastically, and their eyes were all filled with disbelief. After all, even the 1 in 10,000 that the disciple had guessed before was already unbelievable to them. After all, the strongest of those outsiders on this first level could already display the strength of a peak quasi-sage. If this kind of strength was only 1/10,000th of his original strength, then his original strength was already beyond their imagination. They were even prepared to hear their teacher deny this conjecture. However, they did not expect that their teacher would not deny this guess. Instead, their teacher was disappointed that this guess was not bold enough. How could they not feel that this was unbelievable? How could they not feel that this possibility was incomprehensible? Faced with such a situation, the Tao ancestor did not say anything. He only said, "You can add 100 million to this number. Perhaps it's about right." These words instantly stunned all the disciples present. Then, all of them showed expressions of disbelief. Even if they had absolute faith in their teacher and the cultivator who was called the Tao ancestor, they still did not believe this completely ridiculous guess at this moment. There was no other reason for this. This guess had really overturned their worldview. Even if they agreed with everything about their teacher, they still felt that this guess of their teacher was absolutely impossible. Looking at their expressions, the Tao ancestor sighed inwardly and did not dwell on this question any longer. He immediately said, "It doesn't matter if you don't believe it now. When you become more knowledgeable in the future, you will naturally know whether this is true or not." At this moment, a ray of light suddenly appeared out of nowhere and directly fell into the Tao ancestor's hand. The Tao ancestor's expression was slightly shocked, and a strong light appeared in his eyes. "It has finally begun." After a long time, he leisurely sighed, and his expression seemed to be thoughtful. Relying on the Tao ancestor's favor, a disciple stepped forward and asked, "Teacher, may I know what happened? Why does teacher have such a complicated expression?" The Tao ancestor said with a faint smile, "That's because an outsider has entered the 999th layer." Huh? Many disciples were confused. So what? At most, this was just another outsider reincarnating into this level. Could it be that teacher wanted to take in another disciple? Chapter 24, 82. There were two possibilities for entering the 999th level. The first was to be like them, to be cleansed by the mysteries of the 999th level and be reborn on the first level. All of them were precedents. The second possibility was to gain a foothold on the 999th level and think about the final opportunity. Judging from the Tao ancestor's expression, the first possibility was unlikely. That left only the second possibility. When the disciples thought of this, they could not believe what they were thinking. They were dumbfounded and wanted to ask, but did not dare to. After all, after experiencing the terrifying pressure on the 999th level, they knew how strong a foundation and terrifying cultivation were needed to gain a foothold on that level. If those outsiders could gain a foothold on that level, it would mean that the gap between them and the outsider was hundreds of millions of times bigger than they had imagined. This instantly shattered the confidence and arrogance in their hearts. How could they not be in disbelief? Since the Tao ancestor accepted these cultivators as his disciples, he naturally had a deep understanding of their personalities. At this moment, looking at their expressions, he knew that they had already figured it out. He sighed and said, "That's right. It's exactly what you're thinking. That outsider hasn't reincarnated on this level yet. He has indeed gained a foothold on the 999th level." For a moment, the place where the lecture was going to be held fell into silence. Everyone seemed to have forgotten to breathe. At this moment, they recalled what the Tao ancestor said and realized that perhaps their teacher did not exaggerate the outsider's strength. He even slightly reduced the outsider's strength to take care of their pride. Is there really such a huge gap? Then, what chance do we have to obtain the final opportunity? A disciple asked. Although the Tao ancestor had also lost the confidence to seize the final opportunity, it was obvious that he could not say such words in front of his disciples. After all, if he were to say it out loud, how many of these disciples would be able to treat the mysteries and principles contained in the 999 floors of the tall pagoda as their own resources for growth like him? Would they treat this test as an opportunity for growth? Perhaps in the next moment, these disciples would completely lose their drive and become muddle-headed. Therefore, he only said, "This continent contains endless mysteries. You will understand when you see it for yourself. There's indeed an unimaginable gap between us and the outsiders. However, if we carefully comprehend the mysteries and principles of every level, this gap is not impossible to overcome. At the very least, I can see hope when I am of the same status as you." Hearing this, the disciples could not help but look at the Tao ancestor with slightly different gazes. They became even more respectful and idolizing. Of course, amidst this admiration and worship, there was also a subtle sense of hope. It was naturally because they trusted their teacher that they acknowledged him as their master. Since they had already trusted him, they naturally agreed with and trusted his encouragement and the hope that he had expressed. At that moment, the Tao ancestors' words had ignited the hope in their hearts. The subtle seeds of despair that were faintly present in their hearts had been completely erased at this moment. Seeing the changes in everyone, the Tao ancestor was relieved. However, he would not let the disciples see the hidden worries in his heart. How long can this 999th level continent of the Tall Tower exist for? When this continent of the Tall Tower completely disappears, where can we natives go? It was impossible for any land of fortuitous encounters to accommodate countless cultivators to seek the fortuitous encounters contained within. He believed that the fortuitous opportunity pointed to by this 999-story pagoda continent was the same. In other words, when a cultivator passed through many tests and truly came into contact with the final opportunity, it meant that the existence of the land of opportunity had stepped into a countdown. As for how long this countdown could last, it would depend on how long the land of opportunity could continue to exist and how many cultivators could obtain the opportunities within it, of course. No matter how many cultivators there were, no matter how strong the capacity was, as long as it was not infinite, the countdown would definitely exist. After recognizing this, it was normal for the Tao ancestor to be worried. In fact, this kind of worry should have been seen by all cultivators. However, at that moment, the many disciples here did not think too much about it because they trusted their teacher. Even if one or two occasionally thought about it, they would think that they might be one of the powerhouses who would obtain the opportunity in the end because of their teacher's promise. Under such circumstances, they would not feel helpless or sad because of the existence of the countdown. Only the Tao ancestor himself knew that it was many times more difficult to overcome the gap between him and the outsider than what the disciples had imagined. Even if there was infinite time, the possibility of crossing this gap was very small. Moreover, there was the existence of the countdown. Therefore, he and the many disciples under him were not in pain. Just now, when the Tao ancestor sensed the abnormal changes in front of the 999th level, a cultivator passed through the obstruction between this continent and the 998th level and directly broke into the last level. This cultivator was none other than the cultivator who had been by Luo Fan's side and watched him transform the original continent into this 999-floor pagoda continent and set up countless means. He was also the first cultivator to step into the 999th level of the pagoda. This first cultivator had stepped into the 999th level of the pagoda for quite some time. Under normal circumstances, he should have been the first to enter the 999th level of the pagoda. There was a very simple reason why he didn't carry out this plan to the end. Instead, he let the other native cultivators take the lead and enter the final continent before him. It was because he had already seen through the secret hidden in the 999th level of the pagoda before the native cultivators could see the truth. He had seen through the various cultivation mysteries and supreme principles that Luo Fan had spread throughout the 999th level of the pagoda back then. Over the years, he seemed to be constantly heading towards the last level as if he was completely reckless. But in fact, he was more focused on comprehending the endless principles and cultivation mysteries contained in the 999th level of the pagoda. It was also because of this that his speed was many times slower than usual. However, his starting point was many times higher than those native cultivators. Therefore, the comprehension difficulty that was difficult enough to make those native cultivators despair was not too difficult for him. After all, the 999th level of the pagoda did not suppress his strength at all. It did not affect his memory and comprehension ability. No matter how much suppression he faced on any level, in the end, he could use his peak comprehension, observation, and comprehension ability to comprehend everything he wanted to comprehend. In this way, he could comprehend the many mysteries of the 998th level of the pagoda in such a short period of time and directly come to the 999th level of the pagoda. That was right. Although he seemed to be advancing very slowly, which was enough to make anyone look down on him. However, in terms of comprehending the principles and mysteries of cultivation, his speed was already considered to be unimaginably fast, After stepping into the 999th level of the pagoda, the first thing that was reflected in the eyes of the first cultivator was endless light. It was like the endless light that was filled with the forbidden area outside the 999th level of the pagoda. This light produced endless pressure and was filled with endless destructive power. If the first cultivator did not have the embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth, which could be stimulated as soon as it sensed the endless power from the outside world and protected his body and mind, he might have followed in the footsteps of the native cultivators and had everything erased except for the brand that was removed. Could it be that the rulers set up this test to completely eliminate all native cultivators? At this moment, the first cultivator could not help but wonder. He had spent the longest time on the 999th level of the pagoda among all the outsiders. If he admitted that he could not rank first in terms of understanding the native cultivators on the pagoda, then no one would dare to say that they were first. It was precisely because of this that he was very clear about the strengths and weaknesses of the native cultivators born on the pagoda. For the many native cultivators, their advantage was that they were born on the 999th level of the pagoda. The connection between them and the pagoda was indescribably tight. With this close connection, they could obtain more of the principles and mysteries contained in the pagoda, allowing their cultivation speed to far surpass that of the foreign cultivators. It was precisely because of this that in the millions of years since the foreign cultivators came to the 999th level of the pagoda, the cultivation level of the people on the pagoda had more than doubled. In the beginning, they were extremely powerless against the outsiders, but now they could even suppress the outsiders and make them follow their rules. Under normal circumstances, it would take at least tens of millions or even hundreds of millions of years for the cultivation level of a world to improve so much. Moreover, it would also require extremely suitable opportunities and no accidents to happen. This was the effect of this advantage. Compared to this advantage, the native cultivators also had a huge weakness. That was, their true cultivation level was just too low. It should be noted that even the most powerful cultivator on the 999th level of the pagoda only had a cultivation level of the Supreme Emperor realm. Perhaps such a realm was already an incredible achievement for the cultivators on the pagoda, and it was enough for them to brag about it for thousands or even tens of thousands of years. However, to any outsider, this kind of strength was nothing. Even the weakest among them was a fifth tribulation powerhouse. Any one of them could easily wipe out 1,000,000,000,000 supreme emperors with a single thought. With such strength, not to mention possessing the light of heaven and earth, there were probably only a few native cultivators who had even heard of the light of heaven and earth. As such, the setup of the 999th level of the pagoda completely cut off the path for the native cultivators. It was impossible for them to pass the 999th level of the pagoda, and it was impossible for them to enter the land of opportunities that he had entered before. With all sorts of thoughts flashing through his mind, the first cultivator could not help but frown slightly. Deep down, he did not think that his guess just now was very likely to be true. After all, based on his understanding of the ruler, he did not dare to say that his actions were perfect and that he had considered all the details. However, at the very least, the ruler was many times stronger than him. If he were to do it, since he wasn't willing to let those native cultivators enter the final land of fortune and obtain the final fortune, he wouldn't have let those native cultivators have the possibility of triggering the test from the start. This wasn't difficult, even for him. After all, without the participation of the native cultivators, the 999th level of the pagoda would be much more peaceful, and it would be much easier to set up. If even he had thought of this problem, there was no way that the ruler had not thought of it. Right now, the ruler did not stop the native cultivators from triggering the test as he had thought, nor did he prevent them from understanding the existence of the final land of opportunities. In that case, it was clear that his previous assumption that the ruler didn't want the native cultivators to obtain the final opportunity was no longer valid, since he was willing to give them a chance. Why did he set up a test here that only those with the embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth could pass? In the end, this thought appeared in his mind, and he could not help but smile bitterly. His bitter smile was not because of the ruler's strange thoughts, but because he felt helpless about his own weakness. The ruler must have had a reason for doing this. If he could not think of a reason, then there was only one possibility. He was simply too weak. He was so weak that he could not understand the ruler's thoughts. If he could really become as strong as the ruler, then he would be able to understand the ruler with the same level of thinking, and he would definitely be able to understand the difficulties he was currently facing.